I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 301 Flanking Line of Defense. War is like Go, where the goal is to occupy the most points with the fewest stones. Similarly, war is about occupying the most space with the fewest troops. Especially in amphibious operations, space is almost everything. Without space, subsequent troops and supplies cannot be transported ashore, and manpower and ammunition will dwindle with each battle. Without space, artillery that should be in the rear is forced to face enemy rifles on the front lines because they have no rear. Without space, even if you win 10 times, one loss will force you back into the sea and annihilate your entire army, forcing you to start the landing operation all over again. Charles's battle plan was like the corner occupancy strategy in Go. He used the nearly straight defensive line to carve out a triangular landing zone of several square kilometers at the throat of Bourget. General Winter, referring to the documents and map, looked worried. Taking this line won't be easy, Colonel. This is the second line of defense, probably a regiment strong, and the enemy has deployed at least a regiment along the coast, meaning we need to defeat 2 regiments, about 7,000 men, to capture this line. General Gappert chimed in, and you must act quickly enough, otherwise the enemy will immediately use their numerical advantage to launch a counterattack. General Hamilton added, don't forget the enemy also has 105mm howitzers. They'll unleash a barrage of fire in front of the enemy lines. The group discussed the dangers and difficulties of the upcoming battle. Charles looked bewildered. Defeat 2 enemy regiments, detonate a barrage of artillery fire. No, our enemy only has 1 regiment, and they won't have a barrage. Besides, I still believe we have the numerical advantage. General Winter couldn't help but laugh. You're quite humorous, Colonel. We're a landing force, and the enemy has a division of over 10,000 men waiting there. Where do we get the numerical advantage? Gappert and Hamilton didn't laugh. Gappert thought Charles had his reasons for saying that. Hamilton, reminded by Charles, seemed to have thought of something and nodded slightly in agreement. Before Charles could explain, Hamilton analyzed, because our landing point isn't a point, is it? Hamilton looked at Charles. The landing beach north of Bourget was a sharp angle with a horizontal defensive line in the middle, very similar to the letter A, hence it was called a point or a beach. General Winter asked doubtfully, isn't our target a point? How can we capture it without landing at a point? Hamilton pointed to one end of the enemy's second line of defense. We'll land here, and as soon as we're ashore, we'll face the enemy's second line of defense, and on its flank. Generals Gappert and Winter were stunned for a moment, then both looked at Charles with shocked expressions. Charles nodded and replied, why not? We'll advance along this enemy line from west to east. An entire enemy regiment is spread out along this approximately 6-kilometer-long line. We might face less than 100 men at any given moment. This is equivalent to the enemy forming a long, straight I formation, constantly sending troops towards Charles's landing force. Furthermore, General Hamilton added, once this line is breached, the enemy forces deployed along the coast will be surrounded. They have Charles's lines in front and our naval guns behind. Our concern isn't how to defeat them, but how to deal with these prisoners. Charles thought Hamilton was quite capable. After all, he was an army general with rich combat experience. But what Charles didn't know was that Hamilton was only frustrated. He had served in the military for decades, experiencing countless battles, large and small, yet his strategic acumen was far inferior to that of a young rookie who had never fought a war. My God, General Gappert, who had been staring at the map, finally understood. He looked up at Charles and exclaimed, you're a genius, Colonel. What we considered such a difficult battle, you turned into the enemy's nightmare simply by changing the landing point. This battle indeed became a nightmare for the Ottomans, and even for Sanders and Baher. The Ottoman 17th Division, part of the 3rd Army, was stationed at Bourget and had just been transferred to Colonel Baher's command. Baher adjusted the troop deployment of other units, but notably left the 17th Division untouched. He believed the 17th Division was safe and needed no fear of enemy naval bombardment. To the west of Boreal lay the Gulf of Saros, where enemy fleets entering would be bombarded from 3 directions. To the east was the Sea of Marmara, requiring the Dardanelles Strait to reach this side, which was impossible. They had already failed. Balhaur carefully examined the 17th Division's deployment map. A reinforced regiment plus a hastily formed militia regiment were stationed along the coastline. 1 regiment guarded the northwest line of defense around Boreal, another guarded the southeast line, and the remaining regiment was in reserve northeast of Boreal, ready to reinforce the 3 lines of defense at any time. Note: the Ottoman army's organization followed European models, also using a division, 2 brigades, and 4 regiments system. The militia regiment was a temporary addition. Perfect. If the enemy landed here intending to cut off supply lines, they would face a relentless onslaught from the 17th Division. As the artillery fire erupted, Balhaur, exhausted from a night's work, was asleep at his desk. Awakened by the sound, he immediately recognized it as coming from the direction of Boreal. Balhaur rubbed his eyes, yawned, and chuckled easily. These idiots, they actually intend to attack Boreal. They must have a death wish. Though he said this, Balhaur didn't dare to be negligent. He got up and stretched his aching back, simultaneously ordering his staff officer, "Order the 11th Division to prepare to reinforce the 17th Division." "Yes, Colonel," the staff officer replied, jogging to relay the order. The 11th Division was located off the peninsula. Boreal's narrow terrain meant it couldn't deploy too many troops. Too dense a force would result in heavy casualties if bombarded by enemy naval guns. However, before the order could be relayed, another staff officer rushed in, panicked, to report to Balhaur, "Colonel, the 17th Division requests reinforcements. They can't withstand the enemy's attack." "What?" Balhaur looked at the staff officer in surprise. The 17th Division was the second line of defense. The battle had only just begun. How could they possibly be unable to withstand the enemy's attack? "Colonel," the staff officer explained, "the enemy landed on the beach at Ania village, and they were doing it very quickly. They say they have tanks." "Tanks? That's impossible." Balhaur was stunned. Note: the defenders mistook armored landing craft for tanks. The staff officer quickly stepped forward and pointed to the location of Ania village on the map. "Here, on the flank of the second line of defense." Balhaur's face instantly drained of color. It wasn't just the flank of the second line of defense, it was the flank of the entire Boreal line. Chapter 302 Tanks. Those are tanks. In the pre-dawn darkness, on the western side of the second line of defense in the Saros Gulf, the sea wind howled and the air was bitterly cold. Although it was already April, the temperature in Gallipoli was still around 7 degrees Celsius. A light drizzle was falling, making the soldiers of the 69th Infantry Regiment of the 17th Ottoman Division stationed there shiver. "Damn it," Captain Kadir, the battalion commander of the 3rd Infantry Battalion, huddled in his makeshift fortifications, grumbled. "Could they have sent some raincoats or clothing?" His deputy, Issa, replied, "Captain, all our vehicles and animal power are transporting ammunition. Nobody has time for us." Kadir grunted in agreement. He knew this. The gunfire at the front was intense, and ensuring ammunition supply was the top priority. Everything else had to take a backseat. But why hadn't anyone told them to make any preparations before they arrived? "Captain," a soldier shrank back and ran to Kadir, pleading, "Can we make a fire to keep warm? Otherwise, we'll freeze to death before the enemy even arrives." Deputy Battalion Commander Issa rejected the soldier's unreasonable request without hesitation. "No, Mahdi, the fire will reveal our position." Battalion Commander Kadir hesitated for a moment before approving the request. "Sure, but as few as possible, 1 fire per infantry company. Also, take cover." "Yes, Captain," the soldier hurriedly replied. The Deputy Battalion Commander quickly stepped forward to stop him. "Captain, this might not be appropriate. Don't be nervous." Issa, the battalion commander, gestured around, saying, "Look around, no one will land here, especially since we're the second line of defense." The deputy battalion commander looked at the beach and saw 100 meters to his left and agreed with his commander. The beach near Ania village was full of hidden reefs. Even medium-sized fishing boats had to be careful, let alone enemy warships. However, the deputy battalion commander was still somewhat worried. "I heard they invented a landing craft." The battalion commander chuckled. "You mean that coal ship that landed at Cape Helles?" "Don't worry, it can't get in either." The deputy battalion commander was speechless. The coal ship might be able to get in, but it would need to know the route. Suddenly, several shells whistled through the air, followed by several explosions near the trenches. Battalion Commander Kadir's face changed, and he hurriedly shouted, "Put out the fire! Put out the fire!" He thought the fire had attracted the artillery fire. The soldiers, realizing what was happening, frantically used entrenching tools to shovel dirt to extinguish the fire. Then, panting heavily, they lay on the edge of the trench, staring in the direction from which the artillery fire came. Before the soldiers could figure out what was happening, artillery fire erupted one after another. In the lightning-like flashes of the artillery, more than 10 warships appeared on the sea, spitting fire towards the shore in successive bursts. Kadir wasn't nervous. He knew these warships couldn't possibly land here, unless they were crazy. Boom, boom, boom. The cannon fire intensified, engulfing the coastal positions in flames and smoke. The French fleet was firing, this time deployed in 2 battleships, the Gallican and the Charlemagne. More than 10 destroyers also participated. Their mission being to clear as many obstacles and fortifications as possible from the beach, especially barbed wire. Simultaneously with the artillery preparation, landing craft and landing ships, fully loaded with fully armed soldiers, were deployed. A total of 40 landing craft and landing ships, braving the sea wind, approached the shore at top speed. Only then did Kadir realize his mistake. Through his binoculars, he saw rows of small boats approaching through the gunfire and immediately sensed impending doom. These small boats were fast and shallow, and the reefs likely wouldn't be able to trap them. Kadir hesitated for a moment, then hurriedly shouted amidst the gunfire, "Organize a defense." "They're landing here," but no one heard him. Completely unprepared, the soldiers showed signs of collapse the moment the shells opened fire. Soon, the shells began to extend backward. Kadir jogged along, dragging his soldiers to their feet and setting up their rifles on the trenches. Perhaps by coincidence, the sun was already halfway up, its rays illuminating the beach of Inya village on the left side of the defensive line. Kadir suddenly realized that the defensive line wasn't facing the beach at all, and that enemy troops were pouring off those strange ships and spreading out on the shore. Kadir acted decisively, leaping out of the trench and shouting as he ran, "3rd Infantry Battalion, follow me." Perhaps inspired by their commander's bravery, the bewildered soldiers grabbed their rifles and jumped out of the trenches, following Kadir toward the beach. It seemed to be a race to deploy their forces faster. Kadir believed he still had a chance. Although they had lost the initiative, as long as they could hold off the enemy, reinforcements would arrive wave after wave, driving the enemy back into the sea. The key was to prevent them from gaining a foothold on the shore, or things would get very complicated. However, Kadir soon realized he had underestimated his opponent. On their way to the beach, enemy gunfire and artillery fire erupted. The guns were Maxim machine guns from the landing craft, their bullets surging towards the 3rd Infantry Battalion like a tidal wave, with soldiers screaming and falling into pools of blood amidst the whistling sounds. The artillery was mortars, shells exploding through the ranks, tossing soldiers into the air before slamming them back down. Kadir was forced to lie prone on the ground, terrified by the enemy's rapid and intense firepower. Was this a landing operation? Positional warfare from the moment they landed. Kadir's chest heaved. He remembered his German instructors mentioning this small-caliber infantry gun, an invention of Charles, widely used in the French army. But the enemy attacking Gallipoli rarely used such guns. They were either colonial troops or British soldiers. Could this be Charles's troops? This made Kadir realize that today might be a grim day, but he still gritted his teeth and shouted, "Defend in place. Hold them off." Hearing the order, the soldiers dropped to the ground, raised their rifles, and aimed at the enemy. However, an even more unbelievable scene unfolded. The landing ships, which should have been sailing in the sea, drove onto the beach one after another, like cars, providing cover for the infantry as they charged towards them. The soldiers were stunned, and Kadir's mind went blank. What kind of equipment was this? Could it travel in the sea and drive on land? Fire! Fire! Kadir shouted, a hint of panic in his voice, something he had never experienced before. He hoped to stop these monsters with bullets. The soldiers mustered their courage and fired a volley of bullets at the landing ships, only to find that the bullets merely clanged and sparked in front of them. The landing ships continued their unhurried advance, providing cover for the enemy infantry. "Tanks! Those are tanks!" someone shouted in terror. The shouts completely threw the 3rd Infantry Battalion into disarray. No one knew who started it, but they all got up and ran in the opposite direction, ignoring Kadir's shouts from behind. Chapter 303 Log in. 105th Regiment's landing operation went very smoothly. There was no scene of machine guns wildly firing at the landing craft, as the enemy had assumed this was an impossible sea area. Previously, this was indeed impossible to land. Unless the Allied forces stormed the beach in small wooden boats, they would obviously be mercilessly wiped out at sea. But now, with landing ships and landing craft, everything became simple. The landing troops only needed to land under artillery cover, deploy their forces, and then achieve victory. Charles, standing on the transport ship Henri, looked through his binoculars at the fleeing Ottoman soldiers and praised, "It's not easy, they've held on until now." Tigany hummed in agreement. Unexpected accidents are extremely dangerous on the battlefield, they can demoralize troops and make them feel destined to lose. In this battle, the Ottoman soldiers experienced at least 3 unexpected events. First, the Allied fleet unexpectedly appeared on the beach and bombarded them. The second time, the Allied forces actually landed here, and did so in such a short time using landing craft, deploying their forces and suppressing the enemy with overwhelming firepower. The third time, they used amphibious landing craft. Tigany could imagine the shock of the Ottoman soldiers seeing the amphibious landing craft sail directly ashore from the sea. The Ottoman soldiers withstood the first 2 unexpected events, but ultimately collapsed under the third. The landing force did not stop. Under the cover of the amphibious landing craft, they advanced along the trenches constructed by the enemy. The attack was a pincer movement from all sides. Several amphibious landing craft on each side of the trenches fired machine guns and rifles down at the targets inside the trenches. In the middle, a squad of soldiers steadily advanced into the trenches, clearing out the remaining enemy. Soldiers following behind the amphibious landing craft used mortars to suppress the enemy's machine gun fire in conjunction with the landing craft. The Ottoman army was routed, they were powerless to stop the landing force's offensive, even for a moment. The landing craft returned, slowly anchoring below the nets beside the transport ship, ready to haul the second wave of troops ashore. Tigany withdrew his binoculars, turned to Charles, and advised, "You don't have to go ashore, Colonel. We understand, you don't need to." Charles gently shook his head. "No, I must go ashore." Charles felt a pang of helplessness. The tradition of the French army was that officers should lead the charge, charging ahead of their soldiers to inspire them and ultimately achieve victory. This was the core of French offensive theory. Although Charles didn't agree with the offensive theory, in this context, as the staff officer of the 105th Regiment, if he couldn't even manage the landing, it would undoubtedly affect the morale of his troops. On the other hand, the major French newspapers would immediately amplify the incident. The entire 105th Regiment has landed. Only Charles remains on the transport ship, far from the battlefield. Does he still think he can enjoy minor treatment? So, this is what Charles meant by amphibious landing. He's in the Dardanelles, but not on the battlefield. Charles sighed inwardly. This was the so-called loneliness at the top. Since the landing was inevitable, there was no need to hesitate. He decided to land with Tigany's command post in the second wave, silencing everyone. Thinking this, Charles gritted his teeth, put his binoculars back in their case, tightened his belt, and like the others, climbed over the transport ship and down the netting. The soldiers gasped at Charles's actions. "God, is that Colonel Charles? Is he going to the battlefield with us? Incredible. I think he should stay on the ship." "I think so too. He shouldn't risk his life on the battlefield." Several soldiers spontaneously crawled beside Charles, carefully protecting him as he climbed down. When he was almost at the landing craft, several more soldiers came forward to help him down. The soldiers swarmed around him, their voices a jumble of pleas. "You shouldn't come down, Colonel. The good you've done and the equipment you've invented have saved so many lives. We won't allow you to risk your life on the battlefield. Yes, you can play a greater role. Fighting is our business. If anything happens to you, it's a loss for France, a loss for the people, and a loss for us all." He figured he had to play his part, so he might as well act bravely and win some popularity. Charles smiled slightly, his tone firm. "No, soldiers. There's no Charles here, no inventor, there's only the staff officer of the 105th Regiment. Leading you to the battlefield is what I should do. I believe you will win. Therefore, I have no fear." Tigany, who had just jumped down from the ropes, shouted, "Long live France!" The soldiers were moved to tears, shouting "Long live France," one after another. The shout seemed contagious, quickly spreading to the surrounding area. Soon, everyone knew that Charles was going to personally land on the shore. The sailors on the destroyers, battleships, trawlers, and minesweepers erupted in cheers, almost drowning out the battleship's cannon fire. Morale soared. To be fair, the landing was indeed dangerous. The Ottoman Empire's artillery had already reacted, firing intermittently at the Ania beach. Some shells landed on the shore, instantly creating large craters and sending up waves of sand. Others landed in the sea, sending up jets of water dozens of meters high like fountains. Charles had seen such scenes before, but being there was a completely different experience. The swaying of the ship, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the icy seawater pouring down from the sky made Charles shiver. He even regretted it. What if the shells had hit his ship? Would all his efforts have been in vain? But it was too late. Charles could only continue to persevere. Having finally reached the shore, Charles was about to catch his breath when he was met with a scene of carnage, corpses strewn across the ground, the air thick with a stench of gunpowder and blood. The bodies were a mix of friend and foe, mostly Ottoman soldiers, lying in various poses, severed limbs, dripping with blood, some even groaning. French soldiers, upon approaching, had unhesitatingly finished them off with a single shot. Charles felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Though he had been mentally prepared, he still couldn't bear it. Tigeny, seeing Charles's pale face, stepped forward to comfort him. "You'll get used to it, Colonel. I felt the same way when I first saw this. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels." Chapter 304 Information Blockade. In the town of Borjal, at the headquarters of the Ottoman Fifth Army, Sanders was stunned when he heard that the enemy had landed from the direction of Ania village. How could they possibly land in that area? Sanders looked at his staff officer in astonishment, paused, and then asked seriously, "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" Sanders thought this was a false report, something that often happened in Gallipoli. Some recruits would use this method to tell their superiors they were busy, thus avoiding real combat. "No, General," the staff officer replied confidently, "it's been confirmed. The enemy has indeed landed, and the 3rd Infantry Battalion station there has already collapsed. We don't know the exact situation yet." Sanders stared at the map in silence for a moment, then made a judgment. This might be a feint by the enemy. Given his current level of understanding and the limitations of his era, it wasn't surprising that he would have such a thought. Due to the suddenness of the attack, the 3rd Infantry Battalion hadn't even had time to make a phone call before it collapsed. Some soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Battalion scattered and fled, but they couldn't transmit information in time. In this era, finding a telephone was difficult, especially since the Gallipoli Peninsula was a poor, desolate mountainous region. Therefore, all Sanders knew was that the enemy had landed in the direction of Ania village. "Ania village is full of hidden reefs," Sanders said, his expression returning to calm. "The enemy couldn't possibly launch a large-scale landing in that direction. They're likely using the darkness before dawn as cover to send a small assault team in small boats to attack." "Is their aim to divert our attention?" the staff officer asked. "Yes," Sanders nodded. "They want us to reinforce Ania village so they can launch a surprise attack from other directions." Thinking this, Sanders didn't hesitate and ordered, "Send a battalion from Balher to reinforce it. The rest of the troops remain stationary and closely monitor other directions, preparing for battle." "Yes, General," the staff officer replied. Just as the staff officer was about to relay the order, Sanders stopped him again. "Send a reconnaissance plane to investigate and see what's going on." Sanders was somewhat uneasy. If the enemy landing in Ania village was real, it would be a fatal blow to the defenses of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Meanwhile, Balher was already overwhelmed with the defense of Ania village. The 3rd Army Corps he commanded comprised 3 infantry divisions totaling over 50,000 men, but the number of troops capable of timely reinforcing Ania village was extremely limited. Other forces were either too far away or defending the coastline. The former were too far to provide immediate relief, while the latter were merely patching up existing defenses, potentially exposing more of the coastline to the enemy. Balher looked at the map and considered for a moment, then muttered to himself, "The only force capable of timely reinforcement is the Army Group's Guard Battalion. Let them get to the front line and hold off the enemy until reinforcements arrive, then we'll be safe." Thinking this, Balher was about to call the Army Group headquarters when the phone rang. It was Staff Officer Quinn, who, like Balher, was from Thessaloniki and they would often chat when they met. The general said it might be a feint by the enemy, Colonel. The staff officer said calmly. We only need to send one battalion to reinforce, and the rest of the troops should remain stationary. We can't afford to panic. I don't think so, Bowser interrupted. Their attack is incredibly fast, unbelievably fast. It can't be a feint. Bowser's judgment was based on the successive loss of contact with the second line of defense, first the 3rd Infantry Battalion, then the 2nd Infantry Battalion. Their situations were identical, all the phones were down. Soon, the phones at these locations were working again, and they replied that everything was normal, but Bowser still felt something was wrong. The same thing happened repeatedly behind a defensive line. Some places were working while others suddenly lost contact, leaving Bowser completely confused. Relax, Colonel, the staff officer analyzed. You know the situation in the waters off Ania village. The reefs there mean that an enemy landing operation in that direction is unsustainable. They can't get continuous supplies, so it can only be a feint. The Ottoman Empire mostly used German Mauser rifles, which didn't use the same ammunition as the French rifles. Therefore, the staff officer's analysis made sense. If the French couldn't continuously deliver supplies during the day, the enemy landing forces' ammunition would dwindle until they ran out of ammunition and supplies. I heard they have tanks, Bowser emphasized, his tone somewhat tense. Tanks invented by Charles. That might be Charles's troops, the staff officer laughed heartily. Colonel, I want to know how tanks land. Bowser was stunned. He had heard that those tanks drove directly from the sea onto the shore, something he himself didn't believe. If he said it, he would only be laughed at again. Seeing that Bowser didn't answer, the staff officer continued, do as the general says. Send a battalion from the 70th Infantry Regiment to reinforce them. Keep an eye on enemy movements in other directions. Yes, sir, obey orders, Bowser replied sullenly. This was part of Charles's offensive plan, to end the battle before the enemy could react. War is often about information. If the enemy knows nothing, they cannot respond effectively. This is difficult to do in modern times, but it was possible in World War I when communication equipment was extremely primitive. Note, it was also possible in World War II. The Blitzkrieg was a rapid infiltration operation carried out without knowing the enemy's situation. Charles's methods of information blockade were roughly in 3 directions. First, the air. The enemy will send reconnaissance planes to conduct reconnaissance. Charles turned his gaze to General Winter. General Winter understood. No problem, I will order the HMS Ark Royal to cooperate with you. Its seaplanes will shoot down anything the enemy can fly. Not just that, General, Charles added, I want them to be able to scout the situation ahead of the offensive line and then pass the intelligence to us. Of course, General Winter nodded. He was confident. The Ottoman Empire only had a dozen or so reconnaissance planes, and they hadn't even been equipped with machine guns yet. Secondly, the land, Charles said, turning to Tijani. Our attack must be fast. If we're fast enough, the enemy won't have time to transmit accurate intelligence. Understood, Colonel, Tijani puffed out his chest. We'll maintain our pace until we see the sea on the other side, Charles added. And then there's the telephone line. We need some people who speak Ottoman, Hamilton chimed in. I'll take care of that. We've prepared plenty of translators. A slight embarrassment crossed Hamilton's face. These translators were originally intended for interrogating prisoners or communicating with the locals, but so far they hadn't been of much use. Chapter 305 Ammunition Supply Problem. The roar of cannons and the deafening sound of gunfire filled the air. Charles, revolver in hand, crouched low as he advanced along the trenches under the protection of his guards. This was the safest place on the battlefield. The troops ahead had largely occupied the trenches and repelled the enemy. Charles and his men only needed to follow along and issue commands from time to time. Even so, some unexpected dangers remained. An hour after Charles landed, his mindset had stabilized considerably. Although blood and corpses, death and cruelty still surrounded him, Charles had decided to face it bravely. In this era, almost every young person had to face the battlefield. There were few exceptions. He thought of the soldiers charging at the forefront, fighting the enemy to the death, while he walked on the blood-soaked path they had carved, carefully protected by guards. If he were still trembling with fear under such circumstances, he might as well have stayed on the transport ship from the start. With this thought in mind, Charles relaxed. He crouched low, mimicking the others, trying to recall the shooting posture he had practiced with Dominic, and the essentials of using a rifle. Charles understood that on the battlefield, one often had to rely on oneself, and he needed to adapt quickly to survive. Just then, a figure burst from a nearby trench, covered in blood and filth, his eyes wide like copper bells, bayonet in hand, charging towards Charles with a shout. The image above shows Ottoman troops in World War I. Some soldiers wear turbans, others flat-topped caps. This was the time Charles meant when he had to rely on himself. His guards, both in front and behind, were of no help. The guard in front didn't even have time to turn his gun, and the guards behind had their view obstructed and didn't know what was happening. Charles's mind went blank, his hands instinctively gripped his gun, and without even aiming, he pulled the trigger. Bang! 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 Charles fired all 6 bullets in one go. Warm blood splattered on Charles's face. The gleaming bayonet was only centimeters from Charles's chest. Its owner, after being hit by a series of bullets, had somehow managed to struggle and close the distance to Charles, until the last bullet struck his head, at which point his head snapped back, and he lay supine in the trench, a look of resentment on his face. Tycoon, who had been leading the way, quickly returned and fired a few more shots at the body with his revolver before finally settling down. "Well done, Colonel," Tycoon nodded approvingly at Charles. "That's your first kill." Then he joked, "Want me to frame it as a souvenir?" The soldiers laughed, but Charles couldn't laugh. What if he had reacted any slower? Would the bayonet have been in his chest? Life and death were separated by a mere instant. He had never felt death so close. Perhaps to divert the soldiers' attention, Tycoon shouted at his guards, "Check every tunnel carefully. Do you know how serious the consequences of your mistakes could be?" "Yes, General," the guards replied in a cacophony of voices, their voices filled with guilt and apology. That was Charles. If they failed to protect him, even if they returned alive, they would be drowned in the spittle of the French people. After that, the guards became even more cautious, and their advance slowed. Soon, Charles noticed that it wasn't just his pace that was slowing down. The entire unit's advance had slowed. "This is a problem of ammunition supply," Tycoon explained. "We keep advancing, and the supply lines behind us are getting longer and longer." "We shouldn't stop," Charles objected. "Don't you understand? The slower we go, the more dangerous it is." "I understand, Colonel," Tycoon replied helplessly. "But we've already advanced 3 kilometers in one go, which means our logistical supply line is also 3 kilometers long. Although the landing ships can transport ammunition, there are only 20 of them. The first wave of soldiers doesn't have enough ammunition. Do you want them to fight the enemy with bayonets?" In Tycoon's view, this was an unsolvable problem. Implementing this infiltration plan would inevitably encounter such issues. This was Charles's fault. When inventing the amphibious landing ship, Charles only envisioned a typical landing operation. Who would have thought that upon reaching the Dardanelles Strait, it would be a rapid infiltration operation spanning 6 kilometers? The landing ships bore a heavy responsibility in this infiltration. They had to continuously transport ammunition between sea and land, and also act as tanks at the forefront to cover the advancing infantry. Therefore, 20 landing ships were simply not enough. Charles pulled out his pocket watch and glanced at it, saying, "Even with bayonets, we must maintain speed. It'll be too late if the enemy reacts." An hour and a half had already passed, and the enemy was roughly aware of the danger. "But," Tycoon shook his head blankly, "using bayonets means heavy casualties, Colonel. We won't be able to hold this line then either." "Then learn to use the enemy's rifles," Charles said. "That shouldn't be difficult." Tycoon shook his head slightly. "While it shouldn't be difficult, they might not be used to it." Charles smiled. "I don't think this is the time to consider getting used to it, General. If we can't maintain speed, we could lose everything. If the infiltration fails, it means we won't be able to encircle them, and all the landing forces will be surrounded and annihilated." Charles then added, "Furthermore, if we encounter ammunition supply problems now, I think we'll have to use the enemy's rifles sooner or later, because we still need to hold this line." Tycoon considered for a moment and then nodded. "Holding this line might require more ammunition, especially if the enemy launches a massive, two-pronged attack." "You're right, Colonel," Tycoon replied, then ordered, "Second echelon, re-equip with enemy rifles and utilize their ammunition." "Yes, General." This alleviated the ammunition shortage, eliminating any concern about running out. The Ottoman army had stockpiled ammunition within the line. Furthermore, the right flank had captured over a dozen truckloads of ammunition during their rapid advance along the road, enough for the 105th Regiment to hold the line for several days. The only problem was the Ottoman rifles. They were based on the Mauser but with a stopper added. Before loading, the stopper had to be pulled out, supposedly a design by the economical Ottomans to prevent soldiers from firing all their ammunition at once. This certainly took some getting used to for the French soldiers. The image above shows the stopper pull tab of an Ottoman rifle from World War I. Chapter 306 Going Around. Sanders paced anxiously in his office. An hour and a half had passed, and the situation on the 69th Infantry Regiment's defensive line remained unclear. The reconnaissance planes sent out were shot down before even reaching the vicinity. One of them, after a brief look from afar, reported that there was indeed fighting on the second line of defense, with vehicles present, but they believed it was just a small-scale skirmish. Later, Sanders realized that this was because the enemy had consistently advanced along the trenches, maintaining a fighting scale of 500 or 600 enemy infantry battalions against 200 or 300 men in a section of the trench. What appeared to be a small-scale battle was actually large enough to shake the entire Gallipoli region and even alter its outcome. Just as Sanders was considering the various possibilities, Staff Officer Quinn rushed into the command post in a panic, his voice hoarse with fear. "General, it's been investigated. The troops landing in the direction of Ania village are the enemy's main force, not a feint." Sanders abruptly stopped and stared at his staff officer in shock. Before he could ask, Quinn explained, "We happened to capture a deserter from the 69th Infantry Regiment. He said the enemy has tanks and is advancing along the trenches. They might have already crossed the center line and reached the vicinity of Buchia village." Tanks? Sanders was skeptical. How could they have tanks? How do tanks land? Quinn shook his head helplessly. "I don't know, General. But Baher said the same thing, and he even said it might be Cheryl's troops." Sanders swallowed hard. If it was Cheryl's troops, that would explain it. Perhaps it was another of his new inventions. Without hesitation, Sanders quickly walked to the map, focusing his gaze on the second line of defense. Quinn immediately located Buchia village and pointed it out. "Here, only 3 miles from the other side of the coast." Sanders' face drained of color instantly. It was too late. At the enemy's speed, 3 miles might only take 20 minutes. When reinforcements arrived, they would face the enemy's complete defensive line and machine guns. Even 10 times the manpower might not be enough to take it down. "Where's Baher?" Sanders asked. "Where is he?" The staff officer immediately called Baher, and soon he answered excitedly, "General, Baher has arrived at Buchia village with his guard company as reinforcements." Clearly, this was Baher acting on his own initiative, disobeying Sanders' orders. But Sanders didn't blame him. Instead, he exclaimed excitedly, "Well done. This guy saved the entire defensive line. No, he saved the Ottoman Empire and saved this war." Buchia village was a small village with only about 30 households. The second defensive line passed just 100 meters to its west. The village was now deserted, with houses collapsed by artillery fire and tattered fishing nets billowing in the sea breeze, creating a desolate scene. Suddenly, amidst a series of rapid, rhythmic footsteps, a troop of fully armed Ottoman soldiers rushed into the village, followed by several trucks loaded with ammunition. It was Baher who arrived. He jumped out of the car, looked around, and issued a series of orders. "Titan, you take a platoon and occupy the eastern high ground. Kenmal, your platoon is responsible for holding the trenches. Organize the soldiers of the 69th Infantry Regiment. And bring up the soldiers behind the trenches. The rest of you, follow me. Use the houses to organize the defense." Colonel, the company commander, running alongside Baher, asked nervously, "I heard the enemy has tanks, and we have nothing. How can we stop them?" "With your body, Bugarang," Baher answered without hesitation. "You in front, I'll be behind you. Any problem?" "No, Colonel," the company commander quickly replied. "No problem." "Very good." Baher stopped in front of a pile of rubble and shouted to the others, "Attention everyone, I'm not asking you to fight, I'm asking you to die under the enemy's guns. If you die, someone else will take your place. Understand?" "Understood, Colonel," the soldiers shouted back. Baher was giving them the resolve to die. He knew that if he didn't die in this battle, enemy tanks would run over all their corpses and block the vital passage to Gallipoli. The soldiers had barely found cover when gunfire erupted from the west. Soon, many routed soldiers retreated from the lines. Baher waved and shouted, "Come here! Come here!" Once the soldiers were inside the lines, Baher yelled at the still shaken troops, "Take up your weapons, soldiers! Otherwise, you won't just die under enemy fire, you'll be killed right now." The routed soldiers could only follow the others in twos and threes, setting up their rifles against the mud houses. The enemy arrived quickly. Within minutes, several tanks emerged from behind the hill. Bowser looked through his binoculars and breathed a sigh of relief. These tanks had wheels, not tracks. "Attention," Bowser shouted, "aim at the tank wheels." "Hear my command?" The soldiers raised their rifles and aimed their sights at the tank wheels. With Bowser's command, gunfire erupted, and the tanks instantly wobbled and came to a halt. The soldiers cheered. They hadn't expected these tanks to be so easy to deal with. Some excitedly shouted to Bowser, "It worked, Colonel. We've held them off." Bowser merely snorted. If the opposing force were Charles's troops, this would only be the first step. Sure enough, the next second, artillery fire erupted, mortar shells exploding one after another in the village, kicking up plumes of dust. Then, a group of French soldiers in red trousers charged towards the village, shouting. The 105th Regiment had kicked a hornet's nest. Their advance was halted for over 10 minutes in the village of Buchia, suffering over 100 casualties without any sign of breakthrough. Tijani, crouching in the trench, quickly spread out a map and pointed to a spot, saying to Char, "We're here, only 3 miles from the finish line. If we move quickly, we can capture the entire defensive line in just over 10 minutes. But the enemy has already captured Buchia village, and their defenses are extremely tight." Char was silent for a moment, then got up and climbed onto the trench, cautiously peeking out and observing Buchia village 500 meters away through binoculars. Machine guns were firing in a crossfire pattern, and the only high point nearby was under their control. The routed soldiers and troops from the rear trenches had all been pulled up to reinforce this defensive line. It had become a tough nut to crack. Even if all the troops were piled up there, a successful breakthrough wasn't guaranteed. After a moment's thought, Char ordered, "Go around it. I bet the trenches behind it are empty. It's undefended." Tijani looked at Char in surprise. As if to say, "How can you be so sure? The Third Crusade is about to begin, and the protagonist becomes Jesus' younger brother, experiencing an online resurrection in Jerusalem, and demonstrating how to seize the family fortune. Old man, it's time to dump your gold." Chapter 307 Capturing Charles Alive. "I can't be sure," Charles answered decisively. "But we have no choice but to take a gamble." With that, Charles squatted back down in front of the map, pondered for a moment, and then gave a battle plan. Continue the frontal assault to draw the enemy's attention. 6 amphibious landing ships are arriving. Arm them and provide cover for the second echelon to advance along the road. "Advance along the road," Tijani exclaimed, looking at Charles incredulously. Wasn't this too obvious? Amphibious landing ships had previously ventured onto the road, given its proximity to the defensive line. But that was only because the troops had occupied trenches to provide necessary cover. "The amphibious landing craft have forward armor that can stop bullets, Colonel," Tijani reminded him. "If the enemy has defenses on the road, even just a platoon, we could suffer heavy casualties." "Do you think the enemy has enough time to deploy troops on the road?" Charles interrupted Tijani, his voice confident. "No, General. They just arrived and hastily organized their defenses, and their forces aren't strong enough to extend to the road." Seeing Tijani still hesitating, Charles added, "We must act quickly, or the enemy will soon close this gap." Tijani gritted his teeth and nodded. "I'll listen to you. After all, you're Charles." Charles sighed inwardly. Tijani was capable in many ways, especially in naval and land warfare, but he lacked decisiveness. In this situation, not taking the risk meant certain death, while taking the risk offered a glimmer of hope. What was there to consider? Hesitating for even a second was a crime. Fortunately, he didn't waste much time. With one order, the assault team was organized, 2 infantry companies, more than 400 men, led by a captain named Alphonse, to carry out the infiltration. Tijani also provided Alphonse with a spare radio for communication. Charles instructed, "Once you cross the enemy lines, ignore everything else. Take the trenches all the way to the sea." "Understand." "Understood, Colonel," Alphonse replied. After Alphonse led his troops away, Tijani said, "Don't worry, he's the best battalion commander in the 105th Regiment. He knows what to do." Charles was speechless. Even this regimental commander seemed clueless. Bowser lay prone behind the ruins, quietly observing the French army's offensive. In his memory, the French army always charged the enemy recklessly under artillery cover, fighting in dense formations. But this group of soldiers was different. They advanced in skirmish formation, using anything they could find for cover, sometimes lying in shell craters, sometimes hiding behind trees. Once they were hidden, they raised their rifles and fired, covering another advancing group. Baher was somewhat surprised by this tactic of alternating advances while covering each other, which made it difficult for the 3 Maxim machine guns he had brought to be effective. Because while they were firing, the enemy had often already taken cover. Therefore, although the fighting was fierce, the enemy casualties were not high. On the contrary, many Ottoman soldiers on the defensive had died from enemy mortar fire, and 2 machine guns were destroyed because their positions were exposed. Truly impressive, these are Charles's troops, Baher thought to himself. No wonder they advanced so quickly. However, Baher felt increasingly reassured as the battle progressed. Clearly, the tide of battle was turning in the Ottoman army's favor. My goal isn't to defeat you, Baher muttered, putting away his binoculars. I just need to hold you off until reinforcements arrive, and then I'll win. Baher turned to look behind him. More and more troops were arriving as reinforcements. They were soldiers from the 69th Infantry Regiment, who had been holding their positions in the trenches, unsure of what to do. They knew the enemy was coming and could even tell from the gunfire that the enemy was on their flanks. But without orders, they couldn't leave their posts and could only stand there, rifles in hand. Thus, everyone repeated the experience of others, a couple hundred men facing an attack from 500 or 600 enemy soldiers. The line collapsed, and they fled. It was like dominoes, one after another, until the entire defensive line was almost completely destroyed by Charles with minimal effort. It wasn't until Baher arrived and adjusted the defensive orientation in time. Watching the soldiers add 2 heavy machine guns to the line, Baher breathed a sigh of relief, the tension in his heart gradually easing. This battle was almost over. Charles hadn't captured the entire line. Victory belonged to the Ottoman Empire. Then Baher wondered, could Charles be in his army? If they could surround the enemy landing force, could they capture Charles? Baher's eyes lit up, and he looked expectantly in the enemy's direction. If they could do that, it wouldn't just be winning this battle, but also leading the gradually weakening Ottoman Empire to a new peak. Attention, all, Baher shouted triumphantly, Charles is ahead. Defeat them and capture Charles alive. The soldiers were initially taken aback, but suddenly their morale soared, and they shouted in unison, defeat the enemy and capture Charles alive. The shouts even drowned out the gunfire and reached the other side. The translator relayed the message to Tidjani, who looked at Charles with a half-smile and teased, I envy you, Colonel, you're so popular everywhere, should I wave to them? Charles retorted. Tidjani laughed heartily, they won't recognize Charles's hand. Charles peeked out and looked at the battlefield, then said to Tidjani, we can begin. Tidjani nodded and turned to the communications officer, ordering, move. The communications officer immediately used flag signals to inform Alphonse, who was already prepared on the road. Meanwhile, the Ottoman army fought with increasing ferocity. Perhaps knowing that Charles was on the other side, they even launched a counterattack against the French army. The Ottoman army did indeed have the resources for a counterattack. Baher's guard company, along with the regrouped stragglers and troops brought up from the rear trenches, gave them a numerical advantage of nearly 1,000 men. Baher also believed that a counterattack would boost morale, as it would signal to everyone that they were winning. However, just as Baher launched his attack, a burst of machine gun fire suddenly came from the direction of the road. Turning around, he saw a unit advancing along the road under the cover of tanks. They were moving quickly. The tanks were probably traveling at speeds of over 10 kilometers per hour, with soldiers running frantically behind them. The machine guns on the tanks opened fire on the soldiers blocking their path, then quickly broke through and moved to the flanks and rear. Baher knew he was in trouble. The trenches behind him had been emptied. The enemy only needed to run into the trenches, and then they could set up a defensive line behind him. Chapter 308. They succeeded. At that moment, Baher suddenly realized that these wheeled tanks of the enemy were not as vulnerable as he had imagined. Their strength lay not in armor or firepower, but in their superior mobility and flexibility. For example, they were now rapidly advancing along the road, carrying French soldiers, leaving him no time to react. Baher looked back and saw a troop of soldiers from the 69th Infantry Regiment surging towards the village. He quickly jumped in, waving and shouting, "Back up! Hold your lines, now!" However, the soldiers misunderstood Baher's meaning. Their first reaction was that the troops at the front were sufficient, their allies had already repelled the enemy and were securing victory, and they were no longer needed. Disappointed, They reluctantly put away their rifles and began to walk back. They walked, not ran. They were completely unaware of the danger rapidly approaching them, unaware that this was a crucial moment of speed, and that a moment's hesitation could mean certain death. They even looked back every 3 steps, seemingly regretting not having the chance to join the victory and gain honor. Balhaur was furious but helpless. The two sides were separated by over 100 meters, a distance that made communication extremely difficult. Shouting wouldn't be heard clearly, and by the time the messenger arrived and relayed the order, it would likely be too late. Things were worse than Balhaur had imagined. Just as Balhaur sent out the messenger, the French army suddenly left the road and attacked the Ottoman reinforcements of over 200 men. This deviated from Charles's plan, which was for Alphonse to infiltrate further out to seize trenches in undefended areas. Alphonse understood Charles's intention. He had planned the same. However, while observing the Ottoman forces on his flank through binoculars from his amphibious landing craft, he noticed their attention was focused on the front lines where the gunfire was more intense, completely ignoring the French troops flanking them on the road. Alphonse made a decisive move, ordering his troops to attack this unsuspecting enemy. The amphibious landing craft steered away from the road towards the enemy, with French soldiers advancing in columns, rifles in hand. The enemy had only just spotted them, panicking and raising their rifles to organize a defense. But it was too late. The machine guns on the amphibious landing craft unleashed a relentless barrage of fire. 6 Maxim machine guns from 6 landing craft opened fire on the Ottoman soldiers at close range, bullets whipping through the crowd like a whirlwind, instantly creating a bloody storm. Simultaneously, French soldiers leaned out, rifles raised, and fired back. Soon, at Alphonse's command, the soldiers quickly fixed bayonets to their rifles and charged. The Ottoman soldiers offered no resistance. They fell in droves after only a few shots. Some reacted quickly, dropping to the ground to avoid the hail of bullets, but it was futile. They barely looked up to find French soldiers already upon them, shouting and thrusting their needle-shaped bayonets into their necks. In just over 5 minutes, a force of over 200 men was routed. Alphonse didn't halt his advance. He led his troops forward to the trenches, blew a whistle, and hurled a volley of grenades into the trenches. The explosions were followed by an immediate charge. The result was predictable. The French easily captured the trenches and quickly extended their advantage to the other side. This was the French army's advantage. They were equipped with grenades, a crucial weapon in trench warfare. Soldiers could throw a grenade towards the enemy from a corner and charge in the aftershocks. The Ottoman Empire, at this time, hadn't yet produced and equipped itself with grenades, leaving them constantly on the defensive under such attacks. This was one of the reasons why Charles's 105th Regiment was able to advance so quickly. The image above shows a Z-shaped trench. If a trench is built in a straight line, shrapnel will knock down a section once a shell lands inside, or the enemy can easily block the entire trench by occupying just one section and setting up a machine gun along its length. Therefore, it is usually built in a Z shape, even on flat terrain. At that moment, Balhaur knew he had failed. Even if he held on to the village of Ania, it would be useless. The enemy was on both sides, and the trench section was under attack from both sides. If they did not withdraw soon, they might be surrounded and trapped there forever. Looking at the absence of reinforcements to the east, Balhaur could only reluctantly order, retreat. Seeing the Ottoman army retreat, the French army cheered and their morale soared. They quickly took over the trenches, which were only guarded by a few men. At the command post of the Queen Elizabeth, General Winter and General Hamilton were anxiously waiting for telegrams from the front. Since the start of the battle, they had been unaware of the situation at the front. The Charles's forces moved at breakneck speed from the start, with no time to stop and send telegrams. "Does HMS Ark Royal know anything?" General Hamilton asked. He seemed even more anxious than General Winter, as this concerned the outcome of the Gallipoli landings and the safety of the more than 10,000 soldiers already on the island. "They've lost contact with the 105th Infantry Regiment." General Winter shook his head slightly. The Ark Royal seaplanes were originally intended for reconnaissance and to relay intelligence from the front lines to ground troops via message bottles. However, a light rain was falling, and the smoke and fog from the bombardment made it difficult for the pilots to observe the ground. Their only option was to shoot down or drive away enemy aircraft approaching the area. After a moment's thought, Hamilton said seriously to General Winter, "I have a suggestion, General. I believe that if the Charles's offensive is stalled, our fleet, even at the risk of being bombarded from 3 sides, should enter Sarras Bay to provide artillery cover for the Charles, of course. General Winter nodded. This was taking into account that the enemy's artillery was mainly distributed in the Dardanelles, and that the enemy was unprepared in the Thales Bay. General Winter smiled and asked, "You seem to have changed your opinion of Charles." Hamilton looked up at General Winter in surprise, hesitated for a moment, then shook his head, a hint of guilt flashing in his eyes. "No, I've never changed my opinion of Charles, I'm just reluctant to admit it." General Winter nodded in understanding. Acknowledging Charles would be tantamount to denying the British Empire, something every British person would find difficult to accept. But General Winter was used to it. Because up to this point, everything Charles had said and done had been correct, proving how foolish the British military had been. They had initially thought that the Navy alone could force the enemy to surrender. At that moment, the communications officer guarding the radio suddenly turned to Winter and exclaimed, "General, they succeeded. They've successfully captured Angle." Chapter 309. Indeed, only 10 minutes had passed. News of Charles's successful landing soon reached Paris. Le Monde once again beat the clock to the punch, dedicating considerable space to Charles's successful capture of Point A and its strategic significance, exclaiming, "The entire battle lasted only 2 hours and 10 minutes, with a mere 300 casualties, and the troops completed the capture of the Point A defensive line." The straight line distance of the entire defensive line is 6.1 kilometers, and the actual distance of the winding trenches may be 8 kilometers, meaning the troops advanced at a speed of nearly 4 kilometers per hour. That's about the speed of our march. They walked from one end to the other and then told the enemy, "This is our place." Only Charles could do this, and only Charles's troops could. The French people were not particularly concerned. Their expectations of Charles had risen. Such a victory was already expected. Their thinking was, only a defeat by Charles would surprise the French people. They were more concerned with the landing craft and ships Charles used in the battle. But Le Monde and other newspapers made no mention of them. Undoubtedly, this was another result of Gallieni's wartime control over the media. When submitting his application to the government, Gallieni stated, "They are still playing a role in the fighting at a point. If we expose them now, the enemy will immediately know what they are, how they perform, and even analyze their weaknesses. This could have a negative impact on the war effort, or even be dangerous. Control is imperative." This argument was perfectly reasonable, and the government readily agreed. Moreover, the control wasn't limited to the media, it also extended to Wells shipyard. However, people gleaned snippets of information from other sources, which only fueled their curiosity. "I heard that Charles developed a tank that could operate simultaneously on land and sea during this landing operation." Yes, it was reported in the Ottoman newspapers. They attributed the defeat to it. German newspapers also reported it. "I heard there's a landing craft that can directly transport soldiers ashore." If tanks can operate on both land and sea, wouldn't landing craft be a piece of cake? People discussed animatedly, fully utilizing their imaginations to speculate about what this tank, capable of operating on both land and sea, would look like. Only Joka and Camille remained worried. Camille read the newspaper over and over, hoping to find every word about Charles to deduce whether he was on the island. He should stay on the warship, right? In battles like this, he can just command from the warship, just like he commands others from the city defense headquarters. A staff officer means making plans. He doesn't need to personally lead troops into battle, right? Joka simply kept agreeing and trying to comfort him, but he knew the truth was different. The news of Charles personally going to the battlefield was already widely reported in the newspapers. Everyone knew about it and praised Charles's bravery. Neighbors were discussing it privately. "Charles has done so much, he doesn't need to go to the battlefield. No one will blame him." Yes, and Charles is a wealthy capitalist. He could enjoy his wealth for a lifetime, yet he still went to the battlefield. It's a heroic act. He didn't stay away from the war because of his special status. He's different from others. Camille didn't know because Joka spent 100 francs to specially deliver a newspaper to Camille and also asked the neighbors not to mention the matter to him. Charles was capable of solving his own problems. Joka thought he would defeat all enemies and return alive. However, Charles on the battlefield was not so optimistic. After the 105th Regiment successfully captured the Angle defensive line, it was extremely dangerous for at least a period of time. It's like pulling a tooth out of a tiger's mouth. Charles foresaw this when formulating the plan. "This is unbearable for the enemy. They might concentrate all their forces to attack us. trying to annihilate us before we can establish a firm foothold. Charles was right. The battlefield was silent for only half an hour before the sound of artillery erupted again, with at least 100 large-caliber howitzers bombarding the A-angle defensive line. These were artillery pieces deployed by the Ottoman army to blockade the Dardanelles Strait. Not long ago, they had used these cannons to exchange fire with Allied battleships, and now they were using them to bombard the A-angle defensive line. This was one of the most memorable and terrifying experiences Charles had ever had. Even years later, recalling that moment would send chills down his spine. The deafening roar of the artillery shook the entire ground. In the dark, damp tunnel, the air gradually filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder from artillery shells. The soil above his head was shaken loose, rustling down his cap and into his collar, then crawling like insects between his clothes and body. But Charles had no time to pay attention to any of this. He felt as if he were trapped inside an inverted bell, with dozens of bells striking incessantly outside. At first, he could hear the individual strikes and sense the intervals between them, but soon the sounds became a continuous cacophony. Soon, Charles couldn't even hear the artillery fire anymore. He only felt a buzzing in his ears, his consciousness seemingly struggling to escape his body, and his limbs numb and uncontrollable. Finally, the shelling stopped. Charles thought the bombardment had lasted at least an hour. He stumbled out of the tunnel, touched his face, and confirmed that he was still alive. Tigeny followed behind, coughing a few times amidst the smoke. He cautiously peeked out of the trench and said, "We're lucky. A few days ago, the enemy launched a general offensive on S Beach. They must have used a lot of artillery shells in that battle." Charles's head was still spinning. He seemed to hear Tigeny's words, yet also seemed not to, as if he were talking to someone else. After a while, Charles finally reacted. S Beach? Yes, the Ottomans wanted to eliminate the isolated S Beach first before besieging the other beaches. They used a lot of artillery shells in that battle. Wait? Charles stared at Tigeny in astonishment. You mean, if there hadn't been an attack on S Beach, this bombardment would have lasted longer? Of course, Tigeny nodded calmly. Otherwise, how could it have only been 10 minutes? 10 minutes? Charles's expression stiffened, and his lips twitched. What a joke. He took out his pocket watch and glanced at it. The smile vanished from his face. Indeed, only 10 minutes had passed. Chapter 310 Hand Grenade Defense. At a piercing whistle, the Ottoman army launched its charge. From both sides, on the west flank, the 65th Infantry Regiment and the 3rd Militia Regiment, trapped in the A-angle, totaling over 7,000 men. On the east flank, the hastily deployed 70th Infantry Regiment, totaling over 3,000 men. The enemy attempted to strangle Charles's forces in their infancy with his pincer attack. Charles, lying prone behind the parapet of the trench, watched everything through his binoculars. This was the first time he had faced an enemy charge directly. Before him, the enemy was densely packed, wearing fist hats, roaring menacingly, surging towards the defensive line like a red tide, their bayonets gleaming coldly in the sunlight, seemingly eager to drink the enemy's blood. The image above shows Ottoman soldiers wearing fez hats during World War I. Fez hats were not banned until 1925. A thought flashed through Charles's mind. He realized he seemed to be the invader, while these enemies charging with their chests puffed out were the righteous army determined to drive the invaders out of their country. According to movies and television dramas, the Ottomans should have been the victors. But Charles quickly dismissed this idea. He knew it was a deceptive lie. War is about reality. If the righteous army were guaranteed to win, the Mongols could never have conquered such a vast territory. The enemy drew closer, and when they were within 200 meters, Charles could even see their scythe-like mustaches through the aperture of his binoculars. Tigeny, lying prone a dozen meters away, waited until this moment before shouting, "Fire!" The staff officer, already prepared, immediately blew his whistle. Almost simultaneously, gunfire erupted from the defensive line. Rifles pounded, and Maxim machine guns unleashed a furious barrage, dense bullets raining down on the enemy ranks. The rapidly advancing Ottoman army seemed to be halted by an invisible hand, abruptly halted. Blood and screams followed, and soldiers at the forefront fell to the ground in various bizarre positions. However, the Ottoman army ignored this. As the front ranks fell, the rear ranks continued to shout and charge forward, faster and faster, almost at the speed of a 100-meter sprint. Several times, Charles thought they were about to break into the trenches, but Tigeny's orders sent them back by a barrage of grenades. This was Charles's suggestion to Tigeny. Before the enemy's attack, Tigany frowned, holding the intelligence drop by the seaplane. The enemy has amassed over 10,000 men, a colonel, plus an unknown number of artillerymen. Tigany's voice carried a hint of fear. They've managed to amass such a force in such a short time, and they're launching a two-pronged attack. Our forces are severely insufficient. If it's just an attack from one side, a force of 3,000 men can defend a 6-kilometer line, but if it's from both sides, the number of defenders should theoretically double. If one side fails to hold, the 105th Infantry Regiment will face annihilation. Charles thought for a moment and asked Tigany, "General, have you noticed that the Ottoman army has a very low helmet adoption rate?" "They mostly wear those cylindrical caps. Those are called fish caps, Colonel." Tigany gave a bitter smile, his tone self-deprecating. "Even so, their helmet adoption rate is still much higher than ours. France didn't have helmets at this time. Soldiers still wore red caps, and they even needed to cover the bright color with cap covers for safety." Charles hummed in agreement. "What I'm trying to say is that grenades might be very effective against them. The enemy lacked helmets and the tactics and awareness to dodge grenades, making it the perfect opportunity for grenades to shine." Tigany looked at Charles with a helpless expression. "Colonel, have you considered this? Grenades can only be thrown about 50 meters, which is dangerous." Charles understood Tigany's meaning. In this era, the emphasis was on eliminating the enemy beyond firing range, especially for the defending side. It was crucial to avoid letting the enemy get close. Once the enemy rushed into the trenches for hand-to-hand combat, the defensive advantage would be lost. And 50 meters, at high speed, only took a few seconds. They could be right in front of you in the blink of an eye. Charles replied, "Then we need to place a barbed wire fence about 30 meters away to slow down the enemy's movement." Tigany grunted, considered for a moment, and nodded thoughtfully. "Good idea. If there's a barbed wire fence about 30 meters away, those charging in front will instinctively slow down, while the enemy behind will maintain their momentum. They'll be huddled together at about 50 meters, waiting to be bombed." This was also why Tigany waited until the enemy was 200 meters away before opening fire. He was eager to try out this new tactic on the battlefield. He, a proponent of the art of war, seemed oblivious to the fact that if this attempt failed, death might be the only outcome for him and the 105th Infantry Regiment. Fortunately, the tactic proved effective in actual combat. If the Ottomans had grenades, this tactic would obviously be ineffective, as the enemy could throw grenades into the trenches at that distance as well. The Ottoman army's momentum slowed significantly in front of the barbed wire fence, and the front-line soldiers ran through the hail of bullets while untying their packs. This was the best way to deal with barbed wire at the time. They would spread out blankets and lie face down on the wire, allowing their comrades to use their bodies as stepping stones to quickly rush towards the enemy trenches. However, grenades, their tails emitting blue smoke, tumbled through the air and were hurled towards the group. Some Ottoman soldiers knew they were grenades, but untrained, they didn't know they should lie down and take cover. They chose to ignore them and continue charging forward. Boom, boom, dot. In a series of explosions, Ottoman soldiers were blown to the ground. Many were wounded but not killed. Some had their heads ripped open, some had their stomachs torn open by shrapnel, and some were blinded, rolling on the ground and howling in agony. Charles felt a chill run down his spine. He had never witnessed this human tragedy so closely before. The various scenes of pain and cruelty intertwined with screams painted a picture of hell on earth, but the soldiers didn't see it that way. In their eyes, this scene was victory, power, and safety. Their morale soared, and they raised their rifles to take close-range shots at the still capable but stunned enemies before them. Bang! 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 Dot. After a series of gunshots, Ottoman soldiers collapsed into pools of blood, clutching their wounds. Finally, the enemy retreated like a receding tide. The trenches were now littered with the bodies of Ottoman soldiers, some still struggling to move, covered in blood. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 311 Is This War? Colonel, Orderly Adrian, lying prone beside Charles, shouted urgently, his eyes fixed on the enemy, "You should go into the bunker." Due to manpower shortages, Charles's guard company was also engaged in combat, leaving Adrian as the only one capable of protecting him. "No, Adrian," Charles replied, "give me a rifle. Although the idea of going back to the bunker was tempting, Charles resisted. When the nest is overturned, no egg remains unbroken. At this time, everyone should contribute, not protect themselves. Adrian hesitated, wanting to dissuade Charles, but seeing Charles's resolute gaze, he swallowed his words. He ran off quickly, returning shortly with an Ottoman Mauser rifle. At that moment, Charles felt as if Adrian could read his mind, knowing his every thought. Compared to the French Lebel, Charles preferred the Mauser. Its center of gravity was fixed, unlike the Lebel which shifted with each shot, a nightmare for shooters seeking precision. Adrian knew Charles had practiced with rifles before, so he didn't say much. He simply showed Charles the side of the rifle. This is a stopper. You need to pull it back before each load. Understood, Charles replied. Adrian then handed him a belt with dozens of Mauser rifle bullets hanging from it. Charles took it and hurriedly strapped it to his waist. It was much heavier than he had expected. Tycoon happened to be walking over from the other end of the trench. He inspected several nearby machine gun positions and ordered a few men to replenish the barbed wire. There was plenty of barbed wire among the captured supplies, enough for the 105th Infantry Regiment for several days. When he saw the rifle Charles was holding, he exclaimed in surprise, "Colonel." Charles raised the rifle and brandished it. "It gives me a little sense of security." This was at least partly true. Pistols were useless. Killing an enemy at close range required 6 bullets, one of which had to hit the head. Charles thought to himself, when should he improve his pistol? Previously, there had been no sense of urgency, but now he realized that everything was a matter of life and death. "All right," Tycoon nodded, no longer objecting, "but be careful." Of course, Charles smiled. On the battlefield, be careful sounded more like sarcasm. A dozen minutes later, the enemy launched another attack. This time, there was no artillery preparation, clearly indicating to the enemy that they were short of ammunition. This was perhaps also due to the 105th Infantry Regiment's blocking of the road. The Ottoman Empire was a poor country, and during this time they had moved their artillery to the Dardanelles. The 105th Infantry Regiment's blocking of the road directly resulted in their artillery being on one side, while the shells were on the other. The Ottoman soldiers advanced crouching low, rifles in hand, a dark mass slowly approaching. Charles imitated the others, setting up his rifle on the trench, his eyes fixed on the approaching enemy through the sights. It felt different. It was as if a person's life was in his hands, just a slight pull of the trigger. Then, Charles noticed what they were carrying. Upon closer inspection, he realized they were planks of wood, carried by 2 men, one in front and one behind. It was clearly for getting over the barbed wire. Charles felt somewhat relieved. They hadn't realized the main issue was the grenades. Or perhaps they had, but didn't know how. The enemy drew closer. And Charles's palms sweated with tension, despite the still cold weather, and his breathing became rapid. The image of him shooting the Ottoman with a revolver that morning flashed through his mind. In his desperation, Charles had only thought of survival, not considering the potential trouble it would cause and overlooking many details. Now, recalling it, it suddenly became vivid, like a movie playing in his mind. The man's face, filled with murderous intent and hatred, the swaying as bullets struck his body repeatedly, the pain and determination in his eyes, and finally, the bullet hitting his left forehead, a series of bloody black holes, an expression frozen in time. This gave Charles the urge to abandon his rifle and flee, to run as far away as possible and live out his remaining years happily with his wealth. But Charles ultimately persevered. Because Charles understood that this was a world war, and from the moment he invented the tank, he was destined to embark on this extraordinary path of struggle. Still at 300 meters, Tycoon shouted, "Fire!" The command was like flipping the switch of a war machine, and bullets flew towards the enemy like popping beans. But Charles could neither hear nor see anything. Perhaps realizing that this was a life-or-death struggle, he suddenly calmed down at the moment the fighting began, his eyes fixed only on his crosshairs and target. Bang! A bullet whistled out and killed a target. It was an Ottoman officer. He had carefully blackened his red epaulets and even abandoned his sword, but his military boots still gave away his officer status. Perhaps he thought his boots would help him cross the barbed wire on the slippery ground, so he hadn't bothered to change them, not wanting to lose his life because of it. The image above shows an Ottoman officer in uniform. Bang! Another bullet left the barrel. It was a machine gunner, who, along with several comrades, was carrying a Maxim, cautiously advancing through the crowd. They hoped to set up the machine gun at a distance of about 300 meters, then suppress the French defenses at close range and cover their teammates' attack. Charles's bullet disrupted their rhythm, the Maxim swayed, lost its balance, and fell heavily to the ground. Just as the machine gunners were about to lift it again, they were swept down by a volley of machine gun fire. Bang! This time, Charles was shooting a communications soldier, who was rushing up from behind, seemingly delivering an order. He was probably a veteran, constantly using shell craters to leap forward, suddenly darting into cover and then suddenly emerging again, like a cunning rabbit. However, Charles had already anticipated his leap point by aiming at the next shell crater. Sure enough, that was his target. A second before he jumped into the crater, Charles's bullet arrived. It hit. Charles saw a spurt of blood as the bullet passed, but he tumbled into a crater due to inertia. Suddenly, several bullets whizzed past Charles's head. Charles quickly ducked and pulled his head back, realizing he had made a mistake. Staying in one place made him an easy target for enemy snipers. Is this war? Charles thought. It doesn't seem as difficult as he imagined. When he pulled the trigger, he wasn't afraid, because there was no time or space for fear. Chapter 312 Naval Gun Cover. Charles felt little satisfaction with his victory. After all, he had only killed 3 enemies. The enemy's 2 charges, combined with the earlier collapse of the 69th Infantry Regiment, initially estimated total casualties at over 3,000. Charles's mere 3 kills were like a grain of sand dropped into a lake, barely causing a ripple. However, this was no small matter in Tigony's eyes. Concerned for Charles's safety, Tigony, while directing his troops, also kept a close eye on Charles's direction. He saw the targets Charles had killed and was secretly astonished. It wasn't that Charles's marksmanship was exceptional. At a distance of over 200 meters, with the enemy completely exposed in front of the trenches, and clustered together, hitting targets wasn't difficult. The problem was that Charles had chosen valuable targets for precise strikes: officers, machine gunners, and communications soldiers. Finding them in a crowd was difficult enough, let alone killing them. Tigony muttered to himself, it seems Charles's military talent is all-encompassing, not just inventing. Finally, after Charles killed 2 more targets, the Ottoman army was once again driven back by French grenades. By this time, the corpses lying 50 meters in front of the trench had piled up like a small mountain, even obstructing the soldiers' view. Tigony had to order the soldiers to fill sandbags and raise the trench by 1 layer. As noon approached, the light rain finally stopped, and a sliver of sunlight peeked through the clouds. A multicolored rainbow had appeared on the horizon sometime during the day. At any other time, Charles might have marveled at its beauty, but now, no matter how you looked at it, it looked like the sky had been ripped open, spilling out a colorful string of intestines. Charles sat pale-faced on an ammunition box, his rifle within easy reach, leaning against a trench wall, stained with an indistinguishable mixture of blood and mud. Charles tried several times to relax but failed. His muscles remained tense, and he could even feel them trembling slightly. Adrian was bandaging wounded soldiers with medics on the other side when he noticed Charles's condition. He quickly finished his work and ran over. Colonel, he took a piece of bread wrapped in parchment paper from his backpack and handed it to Charles. You might need to eat something. Charles glanced at the bread, shook his head with difficulty, and had no appetite at all. Even the sight of food made his stomach churn. You must eat something, Adrian insisted. Not wanting to eat is just an illusion. Your body actually needs to replenish its energy and water. Charles hesitated for a moment, realizing Adrian's point. He hadn't eaten anything since dawn, and they had been engaged in high-intensity combat. It would be strange if he wasn't hungry. Thinking this, Charles reluctantly took the bread from Adrian, opened it, and forced a few bites. Adrian then handed him a water bottle, which Charles took and drank a few sips, feeling somewhat better. Tigony, as the regimental commander, was constantly busy, running back and forth between the 2 trenches, ordering soldiers to replenish firepower, reinforce the trenches, and add barbed wire. After arranging everything, he ran to Charles's side and plopped down, panting as he exclaimed, "Your mortars have done a great job again, Colonel." "What?" Charles asked, handing him his water bottle. Tigony took the bottle, tilted his head back, and gulped down several mouthfuls. He put the bottle down, took a few deep breaths, wiped his mouth, and replied, "It effectively suppresses enemy machine guns, and it's very safe. This is one of the reasons why our army has only suffered a little over 500 casualties so far." Charles hummed in agreement. Before the mortars, the best way to suppress machine guns was with machine guns themselves. But at this moment, the French machine guns had to sweep the enemy charging from the front, and they couldn't simultaneously target the enemy machine guns that had been secretly set up. The mortars solved this problem perfectly. Once the enemy had machine guns firing from deeper positions, the mortars would immediately fire several shells towards the location of the gunfire. Tidjany glanced cautiously to both sides and said to Charles in a low voice, "But I'm not sure if we can hold out until nightfall." Charles nodded slightly to indicate that he understood. He had just been considering this problem as well. The entire army of over 3,000 men had suffered more than 500 casualties in 2 enemy assaults. This number seemed optimistic. At this rate, they only needed to suffer another 500 casualties to hold out until nightfall. But the battlefield wasn't a simple matter of numerical deduction. 3,000 men suffering 500 casualties to hold out for a morning didn't mean 2,000 men could suffer 500 casualties to hold out for the same duration. When a certain critical point was reached, the 105th Infantry Regiment's firepower would be insufficient to withstand the enemy's charge, the defensive line would suddenly collapse, and everyone would become corpses or prisoners. But no one knew what that critical point was. 2,000 men, 2,300? Or perhaps it would be just a second later. "They can't send reinforcements, can they?" Charles asked. "Yes," Tidjany nodded helplessly. "The Ottomans have blocked the landing beaches with artillery. Transport ships can't get close either. The enemy's coastal artillery has been replenished with ammunition and is ready. Battleships might withstand the bombardment from the coastal artillery, but troop transport ships were a different story. Just a few shots could set them on fire or even detonate their ammunition." Just as the two were frowning in worry, a communications soldier rushed up to report, General Winter has called. They plan to send a fleet to force their way into Saros Bay to provide artillery cover for our forces, including the HMS Queen Elizabeth. General Winter needs to know how to coordinate with us." Charles and Tidjany's eyes lit up. If the fleet could provide artillery support for the defensive line, things would be much easier. Tidjany immediately pulled out a map from his pocket, spread it out, looked at it for a while, and then drew a circle in the area east of the defensive line with his finger. "This is the main force of the enemy's attack. I think the artillery should bombard this area." "No," Charles interrupted Tidjany, pointing to the west of the defensive line, and said, "I think our artillery should bombard this area." "The west?" Tidjany looked up in confusion. "The enemy only has 1 infantry regiment and 1 militia regiment there. They are even running out of ammunition while surrounded by us." "That's precisely why we should bomb the west," Charles explained. "The militia's morale is low. If we add artillery bombardment, they might have internal problems." Tidjany exclaimed "Oh," and suddenly understood. After careful consideration, Tidjany felt that bombing the west was more reasonable. This was not only because the enemy in the west was more likely to collapse, but more importantly, attacking the western angle would allow the battleships to stay away from the coast, and the enemy wouldn't have many coastal defense guns that could hit the battleships. Thinking it over, Tidjany no longer hesitated and nodded. "You're right, attack the west." Chapter 313 Morale Issues. Around 1 p.m., the Allied fleet launched its attack. The fleet, comprising 10 battleships and over 30 destroyers from minesweeping, sailed into the Gulf of Saros amidst the horrified gazes of the Ottomans, anchoring and preparing for bombing amidst the plumes of water kicked up by enemy fire. Initially, the bombardment was sporadic, with each shot followed by a minute's interval, and several seaplanes hovering overhead for gun calibration. This was test firing. Hitting targets on the swaying sea was extremely difficult, and test firing allowed for adjustments based on the impact point. Afterward, the same caliber and type of guns would fire at the target with identical parameters. About 10 minutes later, the cannon fire suddenly intensified, turning the western corner A of the defensive line into a sea of fire. But Charles and his soldiers dared not peek out, for their own lines were inevitably hit by several shells. It's normal for naval guns to deviate from their targets by several miles, especially during a salvo where the ship and the seawater interact violently, causing significant vibrations. This is why first shot hit is crucial in naval warfare. If the first shot misses, subsequent hits become extremely difficult. Hiding in the tunnel, Charles felt the noise and ground tremors were more intense than before, but for some reason, he wasn't afraid. Instead, he felt a strange sense of security. Boragel, Sanders' 5th Army headquarters. The closest point to the front lines was only 3 miles. Sanders could simply climb the hill west of the headquarters, grab his binoculars, and see the Ottoman army's attack on the enemy lines. The attacks were repelled time and again, suffering heavy casualties. The exact numbers weren't yet available, but estimates exceeded 4,000. Sanders believed that the Ottoman army's lack of grenades and mortars was one of the main reasons for the failed attacks. Sanders felt a pang of self-reproach. He had always thought this was a naval and amphibious operation, and that the Ottoman army didn't need grenades. Now he realized how foolish that idea had been. He immediately telegraphed Germany, urgently requesting a batch of grenades and mortars from Austria-Hungary. However, these grenades and mortars wouldn't arrive for at least 2 days. When the artillery fire began, Sanders was already prepared, as his communications officer had informed him that the enemy fleet was within range and ready to bombard them. Staff Officer Quinn repeatedly urged Sanders to move the command post to a safer location, but he refused. Sanders calmly said, "If I withdraw from here, it means admitting defeat. The soldiers will no longer charge fearlessly against the enemy lines." "Do you want that outcome?" "No, General," Quinn said firmly, "I don't want that outcome. But even if you withdraw, they will still fight to the death, I guarantee it." Quinn then added, "Because this is Ottoman territory, we are not fighting for you." Sanders simply smiled and remained silent. As a German, he wasn't risking his life for the Ottoman Empire either, he was fighting for Germany. Of course, there was no need to say that, letting them maintain this misunderstanding was fine. As the cannon fire erupted, Sanders sat at his desk, silently staring at the map before him. The enemy fleet's involvement made the hope of retaking the lines increasingly slim. What kind of army was this? How could they withstand repeated attacks from 20,000 men? Could it really be Charles's troops, as they claimed? Would someone like Charles personally participate in the battle? Sanders remained skeptical. If Germany had Charles, they would have sent an entire army group to protect him instead of sending him to the battlefield. At that moment, Bowser rushed into the office, his face covered in gunpowder, a blood-soaked bandage wrapped around his head, a wound he sustained during the evacuation of Bucha village. Yet, even after that, he continued to fight on the front lines, even personally leading an assault. This was a brave professional soldier, Sanders thought to himself, and one who was both courageous and resourceful. "General," Bowser said anxiously in broken German, "the enemy is bombing the west. We should launch an attack." At this time, Sanders countered, "Do you think that a two-pronged attack failed to break the enemy's lines, and now the west is under bombing and unable to defend itself? Can we take the lines with a unilateral attack?" "I know we can't," Bowser replied, "but if this continues, the west will collapse, and we will lose the chance to retake the lines forever." Sanders was silent for a moment, then calmly replied, "Colonel, I believe the crisis on the west is not because of the enemy's bombing, but because of morale." "Morale?" Bowser was taken aback. Sanders nodded, then asked instead, "Do you think the west is short of troops or men?" Bowser shook his head blankly. The west had a regiment plus a militia regiment, totaling over 7,000 men, plus a logistics unit and an engineer unit trapped there, bringing the actual strength to over 10,000. Sanders asked again, "Is the west short of ammunition?" Bowser shook his head again. The problem wasn't ammunition, the attackers couldn't fire many bullets before falling. The key issue is their inability to break through the enemy lines. Sanders concluded, "Of course, there's no shortage of food on the west side, is there?" Bowser didn't object. To be precise, it wasn't that there wasn't a shortage of food, but rather that they surrendered before it ran out. "You're right, General," Bowser replied, "but the west side is indeed surrounded by the enemy. Their supply lines are cut off, and it's only a matter of time before their food and ammunition run out. What we need is time, Colonel," Sanders said. "If we can't take it today, we'll try tomorrow. If we can't take it tomorrow, we'll try the day after." But the situation on the west side doesn't seem to be able to wait that long. Bowser hummed in agreement. He seemed to understand Sanders' meaning. Whether the west side could hold out was crucial to retaking the lines. If it remained in Ottoman hands, it would allow them to launch a pincer attack on the enemy lines. Otherwise, enemy landing forces would continuously land from there and replenish the lines, and the entire Gallipoli would be in danger. However, "But what else can we do?" Bowser asked doubtfully. "Besides attacking?" Sanders looked at Bowser quietly and asked, "I heard you have high support among the Ottoman army." "You could say that," Bowser nodded, "because I always fight alongside them." Then Bowser looked at Sanders, his eyes filled with confusion. "But what does that have to do with this battle?" Sanders pointed lightly to the western part of the map. "If you appeared here with a troop of soldiers, could you get them to hold out for 2 more days?" Bowser understood. Sanders wanted to send him to the west to command, or rather, to boost morale, within the enemy's encirclement. "No problem, General." Bowser stood up and replied, "I'll set off as soon as it gets dark. I can take a boat around the enemy's lines." Chapter 314. The initiative is in the enemy's hands. Bowser's fishing boat set off at dusk, carrying only 2 guards, a communications platoon, and a radio. By nightfall, they had landed on the western side of the defensive line. Bowser's arrival was met with a warm welcome from the soldiers and civilians. He was like a shot in the arm for those on the verge of collapse. Bowser especially told them loudly, "Brave soldiers, the enemy can block our land roads, but they can't block our sea supply lines. I've made it here safely, and I've even brought food." As he spoke, his men carried sacks of flour from the fishing boat and placed them before everyone. The previously dejected Ottoman soldiers and militiamen instantly erupted in cheers. Bowser continued shouting, "We can use wooden boats and fishing boats to transport food and ammunition under the cover of night. That's not difficult, but we need 2 days to build enough boats. Just hold on for 2 more days, and things will be different. Victory will ultimately be ours." The soldiers' cheers grew even louder. Bowser had brought them hope, the hope of victory, and even more so, the hope of survival. But only Bowser knew that the so-called fishing boats and wooden boats didn't exist. It was simply unrealistic. During the day, Allied seaplanes would spot them, and battleships would sink them from miles away. At night, the Ottoman coastal defenses couldn't see the dark sea, and enemy destroyers would line both sides of the headland, completely blocking it. This was why Bowser chose to set off at dusk, the transition between day and night, where the British laziness and negligence gave him the chance to arrive safely. The cannons roared. Inside the tunnel, Charles lay on a bed made of ammunition boxes by Adrian, his pillow a backpack. He didn't even dare take his quilt out, as it would soon become unusable due to the dampness. Beside the bed was a tree stump left by Ottoman soldiers, upon which sat a kerosene lamp. Once lit, its black smoke filled the space instantly. Before, Charles would have found the smell unbearable, but now he found it enjoyable. It was like incense, dispelling the stench of blood and corpses carried by the sea breeze. In the flickering light, Charles lay on his back, staring blankly at the few planks of wood supporting the tunnel ceiling. He was puzzled by the state of the enemy forces at Point A. Since the fleet entered the Gulf of Saros, it had been bombarding them intermittently for hours, and the bombardment hadn't stopped into the night, with large-caliber shells still occasionally pelting their heads. Charles had assumed the Ottomans would surrender by tonight at the latest. After all, they were mostly militia, engineers, and logistics troops with little combat training, and now in dire straits, they shouldn't be able to hold out for long. Nightfall was their best chance. They could sneak away from their ranks, cross the no-man's land, and surrender to the French. But the reality was quite the opposite. It was already past 8 o'clock in the evening, and only a handful of Ottoman militia had come to surrender, including 2 members of the Anzac, Australasian regiment, who had been taken prisoner and forced to build trenches by the Ottomans, but had managed to escape. What was the reason they hadn't surrendered? Courage? Or the desire to defend their homeland? Just then, a dark figure flashed at the tunnel entrance. Charles rolled over, grabbed the rifle resting on the bedside table, and aimed at the target, his finger already on the trigger. "Hey, Colonel, it's me." Tidjani's voice was slightly tense. "Relax, Adrian is guarding the door. No enemy will come here." Tidjani regretted it a little. He had forgotten that today was Charles's first day in combat. Such newbies were often overly nervous, grabbing their rifles and pulling the trigger at the slightest disturbance. Charles breathed a sigh of relief, put the rifle back in its place, and said with a slightly embarrassed tone, "I'm sorry, General, I don't know what's wrong with me." "I understand," Tidjani replied. "You'll get used to it in a while." "You're just not used to it yet, maybe," Charles replied, feeling that he would never get used to it. Tidjani didn't dwell on the matter. He held a document in his hand, which was the transcript of the interrogation of surrendered Ottoman soldiers. "The matter has been investigated." Tidjani handed the documents to Charles. "It wasn't your plan that was flawed, it was that the enemy had countermeasures." Charles took the documents and examined them under the kerosene lamp. He noticed a name, Batter. "Yes." Tidjani lay sprawled on Charles's bed like a rag doll, letting out a comfortable groan, and replied lazily, Remember how we were almost caught off guard by the enemy in Buchia village today, holding them off for nearly 20 minutes? He disobeyed orders and led his troops to seize it. Charles said, "Oh, this guy was something. He's a colonel," Tigeny continued. "If we're talking about rank, he should at least be a major general or even a lieutenant general. He directly commands 3 divisions, and indirectly commands another 3. This wasn't unusual on the battlefield. Capable officers quickly expand their command during battles, but their rank doesn't always keep up." Tigeny continued, "He entered Point A by sea at nightfall. The Ottomans consider him a war hero, and he says he will build a sea route." Charles understood. Balhaur was using this plum blossom danglement tactic to appease the troops in Point A. Charles then frowned. If the enemy in Point A didn't surrender, the Allied reinforcements wouldn't have room to land. They could only send a few thousand men to reinforce Charles's lines at most. Any more than that would be impossible. The lines couldn't hold them all, and half the troops would be killed by enemy artillery fire. Tigeny got up, grabbed his water bottle, gulped down a few mouthfuls, then lay back down heavily, turning over as if exhausted. His voice grew softer and softer. "They say Balhaur demands at least 2 days. Do you think we can hold out for 2 days?" Charles didn't answer. He considered for a moment, then said, "You might misunderstand. At least 2 days what?" Tigeny murmured dreamily. Charles replied, "Your understanding is that Balhaur ordered them to hold out for 2 days, which is the limit for the defenders at a corner, so we only need to hold out for 2 days, and then the Ottoman army will collapse." Tigeny murmured, "Isn't that right?" Charles smiled slightly. "There's another possibility. After 2 days, the enemy is confident they can break through our lines, which is why Balhaur ordered them to hold out for 2 days. Tigeny seemed to be asleep, not reacting for a few seconds. But suddenly he sat up abruptly, turning to look at Charles in shock. "You mean, the initiative is with the enemy? We only have 2 days to force them to surrender." Chapter 315 2-day deadline. Charles didn't answer. He wasn't actually sure, but he thought the latter was more likely. "But," Tigeny said doubtfully, "what means could the enemy possibly use to break through our lines in 2 days? I mean, they can't now, so why could they in 2 days? The French lines should be getting harder to break through." The first day was a landing and a rapid assault, and they were short of troops, ammunition, and supplies. Even fresh water was a problem. At night, the fleet would continuously bring supplies in, and by now, they were already receiving supplies from transport ships at the western end of the lines. With the added firepower of the fleet, what made the enemy so confident of breaking through in 2 days? Charles replied softly, "Think about it, General. What might be the difference between the enemy now and the enemy 2 days from now?" Tigeny was silent for a moment, then shook his head blankly. He couldn't think of any difference. "However," he added, "could it be the Germans? Will German reinforcements arrive?" "No, General," Charles denied. "Even if it's the Germans, they might not fight as well as the Ottomans." This was true. The Ottomans had fought bravely in this battle. And the German army, even with better personnel and equipment, might not have the same determination to defend their homeland as the Ottomans on this unfamiliar land. Then, Tigeny was even more puzzled. "Grenades," Charles revealed the answer, "and mortars." If these 2 things were delivered to the Ottoman army, Tigeny nodded slightly with a no, his expression instantly becoming serious. The reason the French army had repeatedly repelled the Ottoman attacks was because of their advantage in mortars and grenades. But if the Ottoman army also had grenades and mortars, they could suppress French machine guns with mortars from within the trenches, and soldiers could rush into the French trenches after reaching the 50-meter mark, instead of being blocked outside the 50-meter mark as they were now. Thinking this, Tigeny gradually lost his color. This could potentially deal a fatal blow to the French defenses, the difference between being able to break through the lines and not being able to. Then, Tigeny turned to Charles for help. "What can we do, Colonel? After all, you invented them." Charles laughed. "Inventing them didn't mean there was a way to counter them. If there was, it just meant that what countered a grenade was a grenade, and what countered a mortar was a mortar." Charles replied helplessly, "The only way is to get the enemy to surrender within 2 days, but how can we do that?" Tigeny's voice was somewhat frustrated. "We can't just shout into a megaphone at the enemy in a corner, 'You've been tricked.' There's no sea supply line. Surrender now." That was obviously impossible. Although it was the truth, the enemy would obviously take the French words as a deceptive lie. Charles didn't answer, because he hadn't thought of a solution either. This was unexpected. Charles realized he had underestimated his enemy. The enemy commander was a master strategist. He knew to send someone like Bewilder to a point to boost morale, knew Charles's defensive line had limited space, and knew to use grenades and mortars to counter Charles's defenses. He would even be accumulating troops, artillery, and ammunition over the next 2 days, ready to launch a thunderous attack on Charles's lines. Just then, cheers erupted outside the tunnel. Adrian excitedly rushed in and reported, "General, Colonel, our reinforcements have arrived." Tidjany merely grunted in response. He had initially been looking forward to the reinforcements, but after learning of the 2-day deadline, he lost interest. Several dark figures entered. The kerosene lamp couldn't illuminate their faces, but the leader, wearing a peaked cap and leggings, with a pistol at his waist, could be identified by his rank as a colonel. "General Tidjany." The colonel looked at Charles and introduced himself in fluent English. "I am Richard, commander of the 5th Australian Light Horse Regiment. It's a pleasure to meet you." The image above shows the Anzac troops landing at Gallipoli, their uniforms imitating old British military uniforms. Charles turned his gaze to Tidjany, who then stepped forward with little interest to shake hands with Colonel Richard. "Hello, Colonel Richard, welcome." Though he said this, he thought to himself, "You probably don't know you're here to die, General." Colonel Richard said, somewhat embarrassed by his mistake, and saluted Tidjany apologetically. "Please give your orders." "What should we do?" He seemed eager to go into battle. This made Charles feel uneasy, and he looked at Richard with a strange expression. The Australian army, didn't they know they were a colonial army? Did they know this war had nothing to do with them? Did they know they were being used? If it were something else, like fleecing the sheep, that would be one thing. But this was war, a war that demanded their lives, bloodshed, and tears, with no glory whatsoever. Why were they so eager? It was simply that Charles lacked experience. Being in France, he was unaware that the Australian Prime Minister had immediately declared unconditional support for Britain, even declaring, "Australia will stand firmly on Britain's side until the last drop of blood." Indeed, Australian soldiers displayed even greater bravery than the British on the battlefield, for example, outperforming the British 29th Division at Gallipoli. Tidjany, however, was unfazed. He simply told Colonel Richard, "Tonight, familiarize yourself with the environment and reinforce the fortifications. Tomorrow might be a fierce battle." "Understood, General." Colonel Richard saluted with great enthusiasm. Just as Colonel Richard turned to leave, a bodyguard beside him exclaimed softly, "Colonel, that's Charles. I saw him on the ship." "What?" Colonel Richard turned sharply, his gaze sweeping across the command post before finally settling on Charles, his face filled with astonishment. You are Charles?" "Yes," Charles nodded. Colonel Richard hurriedly stepped forward and saluted Charles, then nervously extended his hand. "I'm so sorry, Colonel, I didn't recognize you." "It's an honor. I've heard of you before, and I know about your battles here." "A perfect plan, Colonel. A stroke of genius. It has changed the entire course of the war. I believe victory is not far away." Tidjany smiled non-committally. Charles sighed inwardly. If he couldn't come up with a solution, he would witness the plan's failure in 2 days. The image above is a close-up of an Australian Legion soldier. Chapter 316 Shen Billy. Hello everyone, let me explain. Images with portraits often have a long review time, possibly due to portrait rights issues. Sometimes it can take more than 10 hours to see them. The 2 images from yesterday were like that. It wasn't that I forgot to post them. If you couldn't see them at the time, please check back the next day. The arrival of the Australian 5th Light Horsemen relieved the pressure on the defensive line. To avoid incompatibility between the French and Australian fighting habits and tactics, Tidjany assigned the eastern trenches to the Australians for defense, while he led the French to guard the western trenches facing the encircled enemy. This wasn't Tidjany entrusting the more dangerous enemy's main attack direction to the Australians. In fact, Tidjany believed that facing the encircled enemy to the west was more dangerous and important, and that the Australians couldn't handle the responsibility, hence this arrangement. If the enemy gives us 2 days, it means we must organize a counter-offensive, Tidjany said. And the best direction of attack is to the west. We should do everything we can to force them to surrender, whether with the support of the fleet or by any other means. In such a battle, we certainly cannot place our hopes on the Australian army. Tidjany still looked down on them, his words always carrying a sense of superiority, despite the Australian army's good performance on the battlefield. The next morning, at the crack of dawn, the cannon fire continued intermittently, the Allied fleet's bombardment of the enemy. Under General Winter's command, the The fleet adopted a rotational bombardment system. He divided the battleships into 5 groups, 2 to 3 ships in each group bombarding for about 4 hours. General Winter believed that this continuous bombardment would keep the enemy under constant pressure and prevent them from resting, perhaps even causing them to collapse at any time. Charles initially thought this would be useful. After all, bombardment was better than no bombardment at all. However, when Charles woke up at dawn and looked towards the enemy through his binoculars, he realized it was all in vain. The Ottoman army had advanced under cover of darkness, constructing a trench that was only 200 or 300 meters from the French trenches at its closest point. To avoid friendly fire, the battleships were concentrating their shells on the more distant tip of the A point during their bombardments. Tycoon, emerging from his tunnel, also saw this and chuckled self-deprecatingly. They must be laughing at us from their trenches, wasting shells all night on useless work. Charles didn't speak. He put away his binoculars and ran along the communication trench towards the Australian trenches on the other side. As expected, the Ottoman army on this side had also built trenches 200 or 300 meters apart. Tycoon followed, glanced in the enemy's direction, and exclaimed in surprise, "They're trying to shorten the charge distance." "Not just that, General," Charles replied, "they're compressing our living space." Tycoon said, "Oh," understanding Charles's meaning. Then he felt a pang of regret. He should have sent troops last night to contest space with the enemy and dig trenches to advance layer by layer, thus accommodating more reinforcements. But last night, his mind was only focused on how to fortify the defenses and deal with the enemy's charge today. Charles hadn't thought of this either. He and Tycoon were caught in the same habitual thinking, assuming the enemy would act as they had yesterday. But that wasn't the case. The enemy commander was very clever. He used a defensive strategy to trap the French lines in the middle, preventing them from advancing. The good news is, the enemy probably won't attack, Charles judged. At least not for the next day or two. "Why?" Tycoon asked. He immediately realized the reason. The French lines had been compressed to their limit, and their forces couldn't be increased further, so the Ottoman army had little reason to attack. Otherwise, if they couldn't break through during the day, the French would be replenished at night, ultimately changing nothing. It was better to wait a couple of days, accumulating strength while waiting for grenades and mortars to arrive, than they could take the French lines in one fell swoop. "Understood," Tycoon sighed softly, cursing under his breath. "Damn Germans, this must be a German idea. The Ottomans wouldn't know how to fight like this." Colonel Richard rushed over, standing respectfully beside Tycoon, his voice filled with self-reproach. "I'm so sorry, General. It's my fault." The sound of artillery shells masked the enemy's trenching. "We didn't notice they had built a defensive line in front of us." Tycoon didn't speak. He couldn't blame Colonel Richard, because the same thing was happening on the other side. He hadn't noticed the enemy's movements either. Suddenly, Charles noticed a faint bright spot flash by in the opposite trench. Charles realized it was sunlight reflected from the enemy's binoculars. Charles immediately put away his binoculars, grabbed his rifle, and aimed at the bright spot. "Maybe it's a big fish," Charles thought. "It must be an officer, observing the French trenches." Charles's gaze swept past the crosshairs and found half a head wearing a black round cap on the other side. It almost blended into the black background. If it weren't for the bright spot earlier, Charles wouldn't have noticed it at all. Tycoon's eyes searched in the direction Charles's gun was pointing, but saw nothing. He chuckled to himself, "Am I getting old and my eyesight is failing?" Just as Charles was about to pull the trigger, a shot rang out, and the black round cap flashed red before disappearing. Charles quickly lowered his gun and ducked back. It wasn't Charles who fired that shot. It was incredibly accurate, hitting the half-head that had peeked out from 300 meters away. Tycoon didn't even know the result. He crouched down and asked Charles with some doubt, "Did you hit it?" Charles nodded, "I hit it." "It must be an officer." Charles turned to Richard. "Who fired it?" Richard was taken aback, then replied, "I'll go check." He crouched down and ran towards the direction of the gunshot, returning shortly with a soldier. The man was a corporal, around 30 years old, and to Charles's surprise, he had a Chinese face. The corporal stood calmly before Charles and reported in English, "Colonel, I fired a shot." Charles asked curiously, "Have you served in the army before?" "No, Colonel," the corporal replied. "I just joined the army a month ago." Charles glanced at the corporal with suspicion. Was that shot just a coincidence? The corporal seemed to understand Charles's meaning. He puffed out his chest, his tone filled with pride. "Colonel, I've been hunting kangaroos in my hometown since I was a teenager. For over 10 years. Such a target is not difficult for me. Kangaroo hunting? Of Chinese descent? Charles thought of someone, a famous sharpshooter from World War I. What's your name? Charles asked. Reporting, Colonel, the corporal replied. My name is Edward Singh. The image above shows William Edward Singh, 1886 to 1943, also known as Billy Singh, a famous sniper from the Gallipoli battlefield during World War I. He was of mixed Chinese and British descent. His father was a vegetable farmer in the suburbs of Shanghai before immigrating to Australia, and his mother was a nurse. He served in the 5th Light Horse Regiment of Australia. Chapter 317 Army Landing. Edward Sham, also known as Billy Sham, even had his story made into a movie. However, because of his Chinese heritage, his heroic deeds were quickly forgotten. After the war, he didn't even have a proper job, making a living by doing manual labor and odd jobs. He eventually died impoverished at the age of 57 in a cheap motel, leaving behind only 5 shillings. Charles needs someone like this by his side, someone with keen insight, superhuman reflexes, and even a sixth sense honed through years of hunting. With him around, if an enemy suddenly appeared, Charles wouldn't need to take action himself. Thinking it over, Charles turned to Richard and asked, I happen to need a bodyguard, Colonel. Of course, no problem, Colonel Richard replied hastily, but then hesitated, glancing at Billy Shin. But he doesn't speak French, so he doesn't seem quite right as your bodyguard. Billy Shin quickly stepped forward, his tone a little nervous. I can learn, Colonel, that's not a problem. And it doesn't seem like much to learn, just simple communication. Colonel Richard looked at Charles. Charles readily agreed, no problem, we have plenty of translators, and so the matter was settled. On the way back to the western defensive line, Charles asked Billy Shen through the translator, you seem very reluctant to stay in your unit. Yes, Billy Shen didn't deny it, his face full of indignation. I do better than many people. Perhaps you think I'm boasting, Colonel, but I'm telling the truth. Even the instructor is a rookie in my eyes. If he were my enemy on the battlefield, I could easily take him down. However, Billy Shen glanced at his rank. Without needing much explanation, Charles instantly understood what was going on: discrimination, double standards, and unfair treatment. With his exceptional skills, he should have been leading a team, perhaps even organizing a special forces unit, yet he remained a corporal. Billy Shen seemed to know he had no future in the Australian army. No matter how well he performed, it wouldn't matter. Therefore, he thought of following Charles in the French army to try his luck. Charles smiled. If it were anyone else, he might still have no chance of advancement, because France had the same problem, but he just happened to run into Charles. Consider yourself lucky. That day, as Charles had predicted, the Ottoman army did not launch an attack. Tigeny, however, seemed very agitated. He paced back and forth in the command post, muttering, we were supposed to be surrounding the enemy, but now the enemy is surrounding us. The front and rear lines are only about 200 meters apart. No matter which way we attack, enemy artillery can bombard our backs, and machine guns can sweep them around. The second line of defense held by the French consisted roughly of 2 trenches, one on the east and one on the west, about 100 meters apart. If the French were to leap from the trenches and attack the enemy to the west, the enemy on the east would, as Tigeny described, sweep machine guns and artillery around the charging French troops from the back. Such a charge was clearly doomed. It would likely be even more disastrous than an Ottoman offensive. General, at that moment, the communications officer came in to report. General Winter sent a telegram saying that the colonel's guess is likely correct. Seaplanes have detected the enemy practicing grenade throwing with wooden sticks. Tigeny grunted, took the telegram, glanced at it, and casually handed it to Charles, his brow furrowing even deeper. Charles took the telegram, looked at it, and said indifferently, this might be a good thing. A good thing? Tigeny looked at Charles in confusion. How could this be a good thing? Charles didn't answer directly. He pointed to a corner on the west side of the defensive line and said, we can boldly guess that the enemy on the west side has deployed its main force close to our defensive line to avoid battleship fire. No, Colonel. Tigeny looked up at Charles. This is not a hypothesis, but a fact. It's obvious. The enemy's main force is right in front of us. The enemy on the west side had not built a single trench, but a complete defensive line composed of 3 trenches. Even assuming each trench requires 2,000 men to defend, these 3 trenches would still hold 6,000 troops. That's definitely the main force of the enemy at Corner A, both in terms of quality and numbers. So, Charles pointed to the eastern side of the defensive line on the map. Why don't we land here? You must be crazy. Tycoon stared at the point Charles pointed out. If we land here, the transport ships would have to penetrate deep into Saros Bay. Enduring the enemy's three-sided coastal artillery fire, the previous landing force had advanced from west to east so that the transport ships could stay away from the death zone in Saros Bay. Now Charles was suggesting landing at the eastern end of the defensive line. That was practically suicide. However, Charles calmly replied, I didn't say fleet landing. Tycoon was bewildered. But without a fleet, how can we land? The army, Charles said firmly. Ourselves, Tycoon laughed. Ourselves? That's the sea, Colonel. Can we swim there? He suddenly realized before he could finish. You mean, amphibious landing ships? Charles smiled without saying a word. Tycoon stared blankly for a while, mouth agape, then suddenly sat down, head down, staring at the map. He exclaimed, God, the enemy's lines are too close. Only 200 or 300 meters away. They think this line is in our way, that we can't get around it. They forgot we have amphibious landing craft. They can bypass their lines from the sea and attack their flanks or even their rear. Then their flanks will be attacked from 2 or even 3 sides. Tycoon excitedly hugged Char's shoulders and shook him. Fantastic, Char, you're a genius. The result of the previous landing will repeat itself. The enemy has unknowingly made the same mistake. These fools, they didn't even think amphibious landing craft could land from the flanks. Char was speechless. Didn't you think of that too? Perhaps it was due to stereotypes. Everyone assumed Char's amphibious landing craft were for sea-to-land landings. They hadn't considered that it could also be used in another way, from land to sea, and then from sea to land for a flanking maneuver. That's why Charles said, this might be a good thing, if the enemy hadn't constructed such a defensive line to try and compress the French army's living space. A angle covers several square kilometers, with various terrains and scattered garrisons. Charles wouldn't know where to infiltrate, and any attempt would likely result in being surrounded. Now, with the enemy concentrated in front of him and linearly distributed, it has created an excellent opportunity for Charles. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 318 Intelligence. The French people were completely oblivious to the danger at the front. Everyone was cheering for Charles's successful capture of the A-point defensive line. They naively assumed that if Charles held the line for a few days, the Ottomans at A-point would collapse and surrender, leading to decisive French victory. Mada Hari thought so too. At that moment, she was enjoying a candlelight dinner with the French Minister of the Navy at his villa in the 16th arrondissement. This was supposed to be their private time, but Harry inadvertently brought up Charles. What an amazing hero, Harry smiled, her eyes sparkling with envy and admiration. Everyone's talking about him. I even met him once. You know what? I was so terrified I didn't dare approach him. I regret it so much. It's unbelievable that he's only 18. He's bound to make a name for himself. These words inexplicably stung the Minister of the Navy. He was in his 60s, nearing the end of his life, and the woman he loved was admiring another man, a young, promising man with a bright future ahead of him. The Minister of the Navy, displeased, silently cut off a piece of steak and put it in his mouth. Unexpectedly, Harley, oblivious to his tact, continued her incessant chatter. Take this battle, for example. Everyone says Charles is sure to win. He's already surrounded the enemy. It's just a matter of time, right? Incredible. Britain sent so many troops and so many warships and couldn't do it, but he did it so easily. If I had the chance, I'd really like to meet him. Could you introduce me to him? The Minister of the Navy, consumed by jealousy, stopped what he was doing and coldly replied, No, Harley, the outcome is still uncertain. They just don't know. Oh, really? Harley paused, looking at the Minister of the Navy with surprise. Then she suddenly laughed, giving him a meaningful look. I understand, darling, what were you thinking? To me, he's still a child. The Minister of the Navy was bewildered, not understanding what Harley was talking about. Until Harley turned her gaze to the steak, cutting it as she said, I'm sorry, darling, I should have mentioned Charles, lest you. She then giggled. The Navy Minister understood Harley's meaning. She thought he was saying the battle was unpredictable because he was jealous of Charles. No, it's true, the Navy minister said, somewhat embarrassed, because he was indeed jealous. All right, I believe you, Harley replied, but a mocking glint flashed in her eyes, and her face showed no sign of belief. There are some things they don't know, the Navy minister couldn't help but explain. The Germans have come up with a plan. They intend to send a batch of grenades and mortars to seize Charles's lines, which would be fatal. Harley's face paled. Is that true? God, does that mean we are going to lose? Not necessarily, the Navy minister replied calmly. So, Charles hopes to launch an attack before the enemy's grenades and mortars arrive, forcing them to surrender. The outcome will be decided by tomorrow morning. Even if the news was leaked to Harley, it wouldn't matter, the Navy minister thought, since she was with him tonight anyway. I see, Harley breathed a sigh of relief, raising her wineglass. To victory, the Navy minister replied. Harley watched with satisfaction as the Navy minister downed his wine in one gulp. She had placed a sleeping pill there earlier, he was sure to get a good night's sleep. At dawn, the sky was overcast, with only a sliver of light appearing in the east. An eerie silence descended, even the howling sea breeze subsided, and the stench of corpses hung heavy on the battlefield at a corner of the Gallipoli Peninsula like an inverted bell. Neither side slept, they seemed to be of one mind, their soldiers preparing for battle in their trenches. The French and Australian troops were strapping grenades to their bodies and attaching bayonets to their rifles, preparing for the impending attack. The Ottoman troops were setting up their rifles in the trenches, machine gunners were busy transporting crates of ammunition to their positions, and some were adding sandbags to the trenches, preparing for defense. The Ottoman army had received intelligence in advance that the French and Australian forces would launch an attack. The intelligence had traveled a long way. First, General Winter discussed the war with the French Minister of the Navy, reporting a somewhat dejected and pessimistic outlook from the front. Then, spies obtained the intelligence from the Minister of the Navy and passed it on to Germany. Germany then relayed the intelligence to Sanders, who was commanding operations in the Ottoman Empire. Sanders had no doubt about the intelligence. It made perfect sense, today was Charles's last chance. Grenades and mortars would arrive tonight, and tomorrow morning would be the start of the Ottoman Empire's general offensive. Sanders, in his military boots, stood on the muddy hill, peering through binoculars at the enemy lines through the hazy sky. If Charles wanted to launch a surprise attack, this morning was the only option, otherwise, they were doomed. The Charles's attack proved real, for soon artillery fire erupted. It was mortar fire, firing one after another into the Ottoman trenches with incredible accuracy, on both sides. Damn it, Sanders frowned. They must have calculated the parameters during the day to be able to fire so accurately. Mortar suppression, followed by grenades thrown into the trenches after advancing to the 50-meter line, maybe they could actually break through the Ottoman army's lines. Send reinforcements immediately. Sanders pointed to the center of the defensive line where the artillery fire was taking place and ordered his staff, we absolutely cannot let them break through the lines. Yes, sir, Quinn responded and relayed the order. At the same time, whistles sounded from the direction of the defensive line, followed by a burst of machine gun fire. Australian and French troops launched an attack on both lines simultaneously, shouting as they jumped out of the trenches, bayonets at the ready, charging towards the Ottoman lines in tight formation. Sanders tensed up. Charles's troops usually didn't use such tight formations in combat. Was he planning to gamble everything? Artillery, Sanders ordered. Order the artillery to provide covering fire. Yes, sir, the staff officer hurriedly relayed the order. The artillery shells they had stockpiled were originally intended for the general offensive, but now that was no longer an option. Boom, 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 dot. A barrage of artillery fire rained down on the position, but it wasn't very accurate, because the enemy and friendly lines were too close together, forcing the artillery to bombard deeper into the enemy lines. What Sanders didn't realize was that everything he was doing was exactly what Charles wanted him to do. Chapter 319 Sniper Company. Despite the support of amphibious landing ships, Char's flanking maneuver still carried significant uncertainty. Char pointed to the sea to the east, saying, if the enemy discovers our amphibious landing ships' infiltration in time, they could use machine guns and artillery to suppress them from all sides, which would be devastating for the landing ships. Tijani nodded in agreement, and there are the enemy's machine guns deployed on both sides of the defensive line. which will create a pincer attack on our attacking forces. If the frontal assault is broken, even if the infiltration troops reach their target, they will be sent to their deaths. Therefore, Shah pointed to the center of the defensive line. We should make the enemy think we are launching a counter-offensive in the middle, diverting their attention. But Tijani looked at Shah with a puzzled expression. How can we let them know? Shah smiled without answering. He had the means to handle that. Sanders was satisfied with the battlefield situation, at least for now. The Australian offensive was fierce. Supported by mortars and grenades, they repeatedly charged into the Ottoman trenches for hand-to-hand combat, but were ultimately repelled by Sanders' artillery and reinforcements. Artillery fire crippled the enemy's reinforcements, while Ottoman reinforcements poured in like a tide. It was obvious that victory would be in the hands of the Ottomans. At that moment, Staff Officer Quinn rushed out of the command post and reported to Sanders, "General, the enemy is attacking from the flank." Sanders grunted in response, assuming the flank attack was intended to disperse the Ottomans' limited firepower and make it easier for the Australians to break through. However, Quinn added, "They're on the verge of collapse." Requesting reinforcements, what? Sanders turned sharply to Quinn, utterly astonished. They'd only just begun. How could they be on the verge of collapse? Moreover, the flanks weren't even the enemy's main attack direction. "General," Quinn handed several telegrams to Sanders, his face pale and his voice urgent, "I believe the flanks are the enemy's main attack direction." Sanders took the telegrams and exclaimed in surprise, "Amphibious landing ships? They're using amphibious landing ships to infiltrate the flanks." "Yes," Quinn replied, "it's possible that at the same moment we bombard the enemy, they launched their attack on the flanks simultaneously." Sanders understood. He had fallen for the enemy's feint attack. While his attention was drawn to the large-scale attack in the center, the enemy launched their real attack on the flanks. Sanders quickly put away his binoculars and hurried to the command post. He soon burst in, panting, and asked, "What's the situation?" The staff officers reported in rapid succession, "The enemy amphibious landing craft have successfully penetrated behind our 3rd Militia Regiment and are launching an attack. The enemy is also attacking from both lines of defense simultaneously. Their artillery fire is intense, mortars. At least dozens are concentrated on the flanks, and the shells are continuously bombarding our positions. Our casualties are heavy. Those must be the mortars and shells the enemy replenished last night." Sanders thought, secretly regretting that he should have blocked the enemy's supply lines, but had abandoned the idea because he couldn't bear to part with the shells. "Machine guns!" Sanders shouted, "Immediately reinforce the machine guns. Artillery, shift your fire direction and suppress the enemy on the flanks." "Yes, sir," the staff officer responded. Sanders' tactical response was correct. With long-range artillery suppressing the enemy mortars, the machine guns could then be effective. In this situation, machine guns would undoubtedly be king. They could simultaneously engage 2 enemy lines of attack, and as long as the machine gun firepower was maintained, the flanks would be secure, allowing the Ottoman army to regain the initiative. However, Sanders underestimated Charles. By this time, Charles had organized a special unit specifically for machine guns, the 1st Sniper Company, commanded by Billy Shen. Unlike a typical company of over 200 men, the Sniper Company had only a little over 100 men, all selected from the best marksmen in the army. Charles called Billy Shen to his side. By this time, he had learned to address the colonel in French. "Your primary objective is the enemy machine guns," Charles said. "Once the fighting begins, I expect that not a single machine gun in your assigned area will fire a single bullet." "Understood," Billy Shen responded confidently. "Aren't you going to ask about other details?" Charles asked, somewhat puzzled. "For example, how large is your assigned area, how many enemies are there, and how many machine guns are there?" "No, Colonel," Billy Shen replied. "I believe the task you assigned me is reasonable. I don't need to worry about that." A clever fellow, Charles thought to himself. Billy Shen must have realized this was a decisive battle, and Charles wouldn't risk everyone's lives, so he wouldn't assign him any tasks beyond his capabilities. However, even a smart man, even with such abilities, was still helpless against the universal discrimination of history. "Also," Charles said, "you should develop the habit of cooperating with others." "Lieutenant, what?" Billy Shen was stunned. He looked at the rank on his uniform and looked at the translator in confusion. "But I'm a corporal. And I never cooperate with others." He thought the translator had mistranslated. Charles interrupted him, gesturing towards a set of equipment piled in the corner of the tunnel. "You're a second lieutenant now. I've had 2 sets of French uniforms sent over, if you'd like, of course, Colonel, Billy Shen replied excitedly. Of course, good heavens, he was already a second lieutenant after just joining the French army. He could wear this uniform and show off to those who used to look down on him. More importantly, this was the French army, a French army even superior to the Australian army. As for cooperating, Charles stared at Billy Shen. There's no room for discussion. You must learn to cooperate. Why? Billy Shen's eyes showed confusion and a hint of resentment. 2 people cooperate, one is the gunman, and the other is the observer. Charles's explanation was simple and clear. The gunman squints, observing the enemy through the crosshairs, striving for accuracy, but his field of vision is small, making it difficult to find valuable targets in a short time over a large area. The observer is equipped with binoculars, specifically to find targets for the gunman. Billy Shen said oh, and then asked, wouldn't that be much more efficient than simply stacking 2 rifles? Yes, Charles nodded. The gunman can always maintain aim and snipe the enemy, without wasting time and becoming distracted while searching. Any objections? No objections, Billy Shen answered immediately. However, a hint of doubt lingered on his face. Could this method really work? What if the cooperation wasn't good? Chapter 320 Sniper Team. On the eve of the attack, the beach at the eastern end of the A-angle defensive line was bathed in sea breeze and waves. The moon, appearing and disappearing through the clouds, cast faint silhouettes of coconut trees. This beach was officially designated A9 on Allied maps. The A represented A-angle, and the number 9 divided the defensive line into 9 sections based on terrain and area, allowing for precise and rapid telegram dispatches to pinpoint situations and reinforcement needs. However, the soldiers at the front disliked these letter and number combinations. They didn't understand their meaning and were easily confused by the double meanings of these designations. They preferred to give these positions familiar and descriptive names. For example, the despair position. This name came from the fact that when French soldiers breached the line, an Ottoman officer, in despair, pressed a pistol to his temple and committed suicide. There was also the snail position. That was A3, its crisscrossing trenches resembling the stripes on a snail's shell. The name A9 was simple, the soldiers called it the sand trench. As the name suggests, the soil here was severely sandy, making it difficult to construct a trench. Perhaps it shouldn't be called difficult, because digging a trench in sand isn't hard, but it was a trench that could collapse at any moment, offering virtually no protection to the soldiers. The soldiers of the 105th Infantry Regiment eventually devised a solution. They first built the trench on the ground using sandbags and baskets, then covered the outside with sand, creating a trench that was virtually invisible. Note, baskets are box-shaped structures made of wood and bamboo, filled with stones and sand to improve the trench's stability and load-bearing capacity. At 8 o'clock, the sand trench welcomed a special team. The majority of them were French soldiers, some corporals, some captains, but the company commander was an Australian second lieutenant. This team was the sniper company led by Billy Shen. Upon arriving at the position, Billy Shen lowered his voice and gathered the 3 platoon leaders around him, ordering, "This is our position for the mission. Tonight's task is to familiarize ourselves with the terrain and construct sniper positions. Second platoon will coordinate with the French troops, and third platoon with the Australian troops. First platoon will serve as a reserve, ready to reinforce at any time. You need to familiarize yourselves with the positions facing both directions. Any problems?" A captain raised his hand. "Lieutenant, why aren't we issuing rifles to everyone? Are there not enough rifles?" This was Billy Shen's order. Observers were only issued pistols, grenades, and binoculars. The other platoon leaders chuckled slightly. They weren't optimistic about this new Australian officer. Billy Shen answered bluntly, "Because observers don't need to carry rifles. It will only make you flustered or expose you to enemy fire." The captain was about to say something when Billy Shen cut him off. "If you feel this is inappropriate, you can choose to withdraw." "I won't have any objections." The captain fell silent instantly. "All right," he said. "I'll do as you say, Lieutenant, but that doesn't mean I agree with your ideas." Billy smiled. He was confident the guy would figure it out after trying it. Before this, Billy had an assistant try out the method Charles had suggested. He invited Sergeant Idris from the Australian Army, the only person in Billy's original unit who was willing to befriend him and deeply sympathize with him. Billy thought of him immediately. The fact was, only Sergeant Idris was suitable to be Billy's observer. The French soldiers wouldn't speak the same language as Billy, which would be fatal on the battlefield. Initially, Billy was worried Idris wouldn't agree. After all, it meant leaving the familiar Australian army to fight alongside French soldiers. But to Billy's surprise, when he approached Sergeant Idris about it, the latter immediately agreed. "Thank you so much, Shen." Idris's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Of course I do, God. This is fighting under Charles's command. Do you know how many people envy you? Thank you so much for remembering me and giving me such a great opportunity." This was Charles's charm. Shen. Billy smiled slightly, his heart finally at ease. Afterwards, the two spent over an hour studying and simulating the two-person coordinated sniping tactic Charles had described. Shen. Billy was surprised to find that it was indeed as Charles had said, far more efficient than two people with two guns. "The only regret is that we don't have a suitable gun for an observer." Shen. Billy took the rifle off Idris's shoulder and brandished it. "You can't carry it, it will only be a burden." "No, I must carry it," Idris strongly objected. "This is the battlefield, Shen. How can I not carry a gun?" This was counterintuitive. From their first day in the army, their superiors had required them to treat their rifles like wives, inseparable, even sleeping together. Now, Shen was asking him to drop his gun. Billy. Shen calmly countered, "Think about it, you're my observer, what's the point of carrying this?" Idris was stunned. Indeed, it was pointless, as the gun was rarely used. Observers mostly used binoculars to search for targets, and if Shen was killed in battle, he could immediately take over the rifle from Shen. Billy. Shen added, "It will only hinder your movements and might expose you. It's a head higher than your head on your shoulder. If the enemy sees the barrel, they can guess there's a head about to be shot through." Idris nodded, but then shook his head. "But I can't just carry nothing, can I? What if the enemy rushes towards us?" Billy. Shen thought for a moment and replied, "Go get a pistol, Sergeant, and also bring a few extra grenades." Grenades might be useful in this situation. Then Billy. Shen muttered to himself, "Actually, we need a handgun more, preferably with some firepower." If Charles heard this, he would definitely marvel at Billy. Shen's talent for sniping. During World War II, observers were typically equipped with submachine guns, which perfectly complemented sniper rifles. Sniper rifles possessed advantages in range and accuracy, but suffered from low rate of fire and insufficient firepower, often proving ineffective when a large group of enemies charged fearlessly towards the sniper team. Submachine guns, while having shorter range and lower accuracy, boasted high rate of fire and sustained firepower, making them excellent at covering the sniper team's retreat. However, for now, that awaited Charles's invention. Chapter 321 Trust. Billy. Shen led his sniper company for several hours to familiarize themselves with the terrain in the sand trenches, sometimes even constructing sniper positions and communication trenches themselves. "We're different from ordinary soldiers," Billy. Shen instructed his men. "When the battle begins tomorrow, if an ordinary soldier is lying in one of our sniper positions, are we supposed to fight him and make him give up his spot?" His men laughed. "Therefore, we need our own sniper positions," Billy. Shen said solemnly. "And we must have multiple sniper positions. We need to move to a different spot after firing a few bullets. This is essential, it's a matter of your lives." Billy. Shen ordered the sniper company to set up their sniper positions in the open ground behind a defensive line, where snipers could move freely without crowding the trenches with ordinary soldiers. Furthermore, the ordinary soldiers in the front line trenches would attract enemy fire and attention, and machine gun fire would also be directed towards them. Some sniper positions were even set up outside the sand trenches. Billy. Shen analyzed the map. "Imagine tomorrow, after the battle begins, our soldiers will leap from the trenches and charge the enemy. What if your sniper positions are directly behind the sand trenches?" The soldiers were all stunned. None of them had considered this. They might not see a single enemy because their view would be blocked by their own backs. So, the sniper positions were immediately changed to high ground and the flanks of the attack. After these preparations, they practiced the observer-shooter coordination again. Billy. Shen gave one last order: "Sleep, and you must be asleep. Sufficient sleep is essential for the quality of the next day's battle." This is common sense. The soldiers understood this, but it was the hardest part. Most failed to achieve it, including Idris. Billy. Shen, however, simply leaned against the sandbags and soon began to snore evenly. He often spent the night in the wild while hunting kangaroos in Australia, so this was nothing new for him. The only drawback was that at this time of year, He should have enjoyed a delicious roasted kangaroo meal and fallen asleep to the warmth of the campfire and the crackling of burning wood. At 5 in the morning, before dawn, Billy Shin was awakened by the roar of naval guns. He rolled over and stood still in the trench, gripping his rifle and cautiously peering towards the direction of the exploding shells, a strange feeling creeping into his heart. Since the Ottomans approached and began constructing trenches, the fleet had abandoned its continuous bombardment of Point A. It was pointless. But now, the fleet had suddenly resumed its shelling, still targeting Point A. What was the point? Billy Shin frowned. Then, he saw amphibious landing craft emerging from their shelters, surrounded by a troop of soldiers, and slowly making their way towards the beach. Billy Shin was startled, then understood. A clever fellow, Billy Shin shook his head with a smile. He plans to use amphibious landing craft to bypass us from the sea. The naval bombardment was, of course, to mask the engine noise of the amphibious landing craft. Then, Billy Shin understood why Charles had positioned the sniper company here. The sand trench was the most important main attack direction, it couldn't be lost. And the enemy machine guns were the biggest obstacle to the French army's success. "Lieutenant," Idris' excited voice came from the darkness on one side of the trench. "It's Charles." "I see Charles. He's looking for you," Billy Shin said and ran towards the direction Idris had come from, rifle in hand. Charles was carrying a rifle, which seemed somewhat incongruous with his colonel rank and staff officer status, but Billy Shin had heard that Charles was a very good marksman. He had already killed more than a dozen enemies in previous battles. Billy Shin had no doubt about this. If Charles didn't understand guns, he couldn't have invented a two-man sniper team tactic. "Colonel," Billy Shin stepped forward to stand in front of Charles. "Ready?" Charles asked. "Yes, ready," Billy Shin replied confidently. "Very good," Charles nodded. "Prepare for battle. Attack at 5:30. "Yes, sir," Billy Shin responded, then asked doubtfully, "Colonel, aren't you going to check on the preparations?" "I trust you to handle it," Charles replied, patting Billy Shin on the shoulder before leaving. Billy Shin stood there stunned for a long while. He had never received this level of trust before. From childhood to adulthood, no matter what he did, he was always questioned or belittled, even though he had done his best. But Charles, not only did he not question how he was doing, entrusting him with such an important task, but he also maintained absolute trust. This made Billy Shin somewhat uneasy. Billy Shin turned to look at Charles's back, unconsciously pondering a question. He was already 30 years old. He had been carrying a gun and sleeping in the open since his teens, which was undeniably hard work, but what was the purpose of all this? Was it to get rich, or to get promoted? Or was it simply to make a living? Or perhaps, what he truly desired was simply recognition. Unbeknownst to him, Billy Shin's eyes were already reddening. He felt he had made the right choice. He had gotten what he wanted. This was what he truly desired. Charles was unaware of Billy Shin's internal struggle, or perhaps it could be described as a moment of reflection. His trust in Billy Shin stemmed not from anything else, but simply from the fact that he was Billy Shin. This man was the sniper with the highest kill count in World War I, having taken down 150 targets in just 4 months of service at Gallipoli, with a final confirmed kill count reaching 201. At that time, he was still a new recruit, having only recently joined the army. Note: 150 kills were achieved with an observer present. Additional kills occurred without observers. More importantly, he invented a two-person sniping tactic, a tactic still in use today. If Charles didn't trust such a sniper talent, who else could he trust? Charles entered the sand trenches he had heard so much about, cautiously peeking out and peering through his binoculars towards the enemy lines. In the moonlight, the enemy's machine gun positions were faintly visible, some even covered with sandbags with only a small hole showing. This would be a severe test for Billy Shin, Charles thought, but it shouldn't be too difficult for him. Just then, Tijani approached Charles with several communications soldiers, nodded towards the beach, and said, "Ready, MM." Charles replied softly. It was the elite 105th Infantry Regiment, only 400 men strong, hidden along the shore with amphibious landing craft, covered by tarpaulins. At a single command, they would rush to the sea and then circle around to the enemy's flank. Charles's gaze shifted to the east, where a faint white light was beginning to appear. Chapter 322: Breaking the Blockade. Craters, corpses, and charred vegetation, the trees in the no-man's land were shattered, leaving only bare trunks, seemingly telling tales of their suffering. Many parts of the battlefield began to resemble the cratered surface of the moon, the difference being that the moon is white, while the battlefield was a gray expanse. In the distance, the ground bulged in the morning light, revealing faint brown or limestone mounds, the enemy's parapets and fortifications erected in front of their trenches for cover. Suddenly, a piercing whistle rang out, signaling the start of the battle to break through the blockade. The battle began with an attack on the central section of the defensive line. The Allied forces' concentrated offensive would inevitably draw Ottoman artillery fire, otherwise, the central Ottoman line might be breached. As soon as the Ottoman artillery opened fire, Charles immediately ordered the main attacking force in the sand trenches to launch an assault. Amidst shouts, the prepared French and Australian soldiers leaped from their trenches, bayonets at the ready, charging through the pre-cut barbed wire towards the enemy lines. There was no artillery fire. The enemy's artillery fire was temporarily drawn to the middle of the defensive line. There was also no machine gun fire. The enemy machine gunners hastily took their positions, completely unaware that they were already being targeted by enemy snipers. After a few shots, they fell one by one in pools of blood. Backup machine gunners continued to be brought up, but were soon shot down as well. The Ottoman soldiers didn't even realize it was the enemy snipers doing. At this time, enemy mortars were also bombarding the machine gun positions, and they assumed it was the intense enemy artillery fire rendering the machine guns ineffective. Fortunately, the French and Australian advance was halted by the barbed wire laid out by the Ottoman army on the front line, buying the Ottomans time to fire their rifles at the enemy with lightning speed. Amidst screams of agony, the French and Australian offensive was barely halted. 10 o'clock, 400 meters, it was reported the coordinates. It was a machine gunner crouching low as he ran towards the machine gun position. It was noticed he was carrying a Maxim ammunition box. Without hesitation, Billy Shen raised his gun, turned, and immediately located the target. Bang! A gunshot rang out, and the machine gunner clutched his chest and fell to the ground. 3 o'clock, 250 meters, it was reported another coordinate. It was an officer, nervously making a phone call, seemingly reporting to the rear. Bang! A gunshot rang out, a bullet prematurely ending the officer's conversation. 2 o'clock, 300 meters, there, a machine gun was spitting fire at the French troops. This machine gun position was cleverly set up. It was camouflaged by logs covering the top of the trench and then covered with a layer of sand matching the surrounding area, so no one had noticed it during the terrain reconnaissance the previous night. Billy Shen hesitated noticeably when he found the target. Idris felt a pang of regret. This machine gun was completely enclosed, like a bunker, with only a firing port exposed. A sniper could only see the muzzle flash and a small bullet trajectory, nothing else. He shouldn't have given this target to Billy Shen, it was thought. This wasn't a target a sniper could handle. However, just as Idris was about to look for the next possible target, a gunshot rang out, and the machine gun went silent. Idris stared in astonishment at Billy Shen, not understanding how he had done it. This was not difficult for Billy Shen. He deduced the gunner's position from the direction of the machine gun fire. His hesitation just now wasn't because he found it difficult, but because he was waiting for the machine gun to turn so the gunner would enter his firing range. While Idris was still stunned, Billy Shen pulled the trigger again, then turned back and ordered, "Change positions." Idris snapped out of his daze, quickly putting away his binoculars and crouching down to follow Billy Shen. Perhaps because they had received prior intelligence, the Ottoman army had replenished barbed wire and laid mines on the battlefield, causing considerable trouble for the French army's charge. But that wasn't the main point. The Ottoman army, busy with defense, didn't notice that 20 amphibious landing craft had appeared on the other side of the sea. They were moving slowly, less than 10 knots. The enemy and friendly lines were only 200 or 300 meters apart, a distance that should theoretically take only a minute to reach, but in reality it took 3 minutes because the amphibious landing craft could reach their positions at top speed. Then, to the Ottoman army's horror, 20 tanks suddenly appeared on the flank beach. They advanced rapidly, machine gunning the enemy, while French soldiers jumped off the tanks, throwing grenades and occupying trenches. The Ottoman 3rd Militia Regiment, already terrified by the French advance, was suddenly attacked from the flank by the tanks. In a panic, they abandoned their lines and fled. The amphibious landing craft continued their advance, calmly reaping enemy lives with their machine guns, causing groups of Ottoman militiamen to surrender, raising their rifles and kneeling on the ground. With the pressure on the main French force lessened, they soon surged into the enemy lines like a tide. Thus, The Ottoman army's flank defenses were successfully breached in less than 10 minutes. The speed was so fast that Bewilder, stationed at point A, didn't even notice the danger as the French rapidly expanded their gains along the gaps in the enemy's lines. At that time, Bewilder was in the middle of the defensive line directing his troops to defend against the French attack. He believed the French were desperate, forced to launch this massed assault, otherwise they had no hope of breaking through the lines. Therefore, Bewilder excitedly shouted to his men, "Hold on! This is the enemy's last stand, they know their end is near, they're struggling in their death throes, victory will surely be ours. Long live the Ottoman Empire." However, just as his shouts boosted the soldiers' morale, a communications soldier rushed to Bewilder with a telegram, reporting in a panic, "Colonel, the general orders you to retreat immediately." Retreat? Bewilder stared at the communications soldier in astonishment. They were winning, why retreat? Besides, the sea was behind them, where could they go? "Our lines have collapsed," the communications officer reported frantically. "The general orders you to immediately evacuate by boat to Boreal. It'll be too late if you delay." Bewilder was stunned, then laughed. Impossible. He snatched the telegram, glanced at it, and his face changed drastically. He didn't know the flank had collapsed because the troops trapped in a corner were severely lacking in supplies. There were barely any telephones on the line. Sanders could clearly see the disastrous collapse of his lines and thus ordered him to evacuate via telegram. Bewilder looked towards his eastern flank and sighed helplessly, "We've lost to Charles twice, using the same tactics." Chapter 323 The Battle of Public Opinion. The Battle of Borough of Abel ended in a complete rout of the Ottoman army at point A, allowing the French army to successfully occupy the area and gain valuable landing and survival space. The French landing at point A meant a complete blockade of supply lines to the Gallipoli Peninsula. Once the French 75mm artillery was brought ashore, the Ottoman army would be unable to even transport supplies by manpower, bypassing the roads. Defending the Gallipoli Peninsula became an almost impossible task for the Ottoman army. Therefore, under Sanders' command, the Ottoman army withdrew entirely from the Gallipoli Peninsula, retreating east of Borough of Abel to establish a new defensive line to continue the confrontation with the Allies. What Charles witnessed were groups of Ottomans captured by the Allies, unable to evacuate in time. They were ragged and filthy, but their eyes were filled with hatred as they looked at the French. Over 7,000 militia and regular soldiers were captured at point A, and more than 10,000 were captured in other directions, totaling over 21,000 prisoners. But Charles knew that the victory at Gallipoli did not mean the end of the Dardanelles campaign. The other side of the strait was still in Ottoman hands, and the Ottomans could still use mines and submarines to prevent the Allied fleet from entering the Sea of Marmara. Moreover, the number of mines and submarines would increase, and they might even extend into the Sea of Marmara. In addition, many scattered troops in Gallipoli were hiding in the mountains and jungles, continuing to fight the Allies. Therefore, the war had only taken its first step, and many difficulties remained. At times, Charles found it incomprehensible that the First Lord of the Admiralty believed that such a difficult and complex battlefield could be resolved with just a few warships. Even more tragically, the First Lord of the Admiralty made serious mistakes in both strategy and tactics in this campaign. However, he successfully whitewashed himself by using his influence, portraying the defeat as a great success in the strategic direction, but poor tactical implementation ultimately led to failure. The French media, however, were generally optimistic about the battle, reporting extensively on Charles's victory at Gallipoli. Just as everyone predicted, Charles did not disappoint. He single-handedly turned the tide of the war, bringing Gallipoli completely under Allied control. This is a true amphibious operation. Charles pioneered human amphibious warfare. This battle will surely be recorded in history as a classic. From now on, it's only a matter of time before the fleet enters the Sea of Marmara. At least one side of the Dardanelles Strait is safe. The French citizens were once again ecstatic upon seeing the news of the victory. Compared to Charles's previous victories, this time Charles outmaneuvered the British on the battlefield, filling the French citizens with immense pride. Look, the British committed an entire fleet and organized tens of thousands of troops for a landing, yet they're stuck at Gallipoli, while Charles, with only 3,000 men, achieved a decisive victory in just a few days. I heard Charles warn the British from the beginning, but they ignored him, hence this defeat. I also heard they contacted Charles through General Winter, but the proud British didn't take Charles's advice seriously at all. This news came from the city's defense command. It couldn't be considered a leak, as it was outdated intelligence. American newspapers also gave extensive coverage to the battle, and even the military conducted simulations and reenactments. Although the United States hadn't yet entered the war, it had consistently sided with the Allied powers, and its entry was only a matter of time. Therefore, they desperately wanted to gain combat experience and modern equipment before entering the war, rapidly modernizing their outdated army and tactics to international standards. Only British newspapers gave lukewarm coverage to the victory, emphasizing the fire support of the British fleet and the role of the Australian 5th Light Horse Regiment. If that were all, it wouldn't seem like a major problem. However, public opinion continued to ferment, gradually developing interest struggled between Britain and France for control and command of the war. Even the British themselves were discussing the question, if Charles had commanded this battle from the beginning, would it have lasted so long, with so many casualties and battleships lost? The answer was clearly no. Military and political circles in various countries made a startling assessment. If Charles's tactics had been used from the start, the battle might have ended within a week, with casualties likely less than 1,000. Because the Ottomans were completely unprepared, they only had artillery, no infantry. On the Gallipoli Peninsula, Charles could easily land on the peninsula and strangle the enemy. Then, the Ottomans couldn't transport ammunition into the peninsula, our warships wouldn't be bombarded, and the Ottomans couldn't lay torpedoes smoothly. It's laughable that the British Army used such an important location as Bordel as a feint attack position. Outside the military and political circles, the discussion was simpler and more colloquial. If Charles had commanded, wouldn't many fewer people have died? To those politicians, it might just be a casualty statistic, but to us, it's lives. We should demand that the British hand over command to Charles. It would benefit everyone. And they actually did it. First, France launched several demonstrations, followed quickly by Australia and New Zealand. France did it for honor. Most of its troops deployed to Gallipoli were colonial soldiers, and the casualties of these troops didn't affect most of them deeply. Australia and New Zealand, on the other hand, participated to avoid unnecessary casualties. Most of those participating in the demonstrations were military dependents. Soon, even in Britain, similar marches and chants arose. If victory can be achieved at a lower cost, why not? Does it matter who leads this war? Isn't victory what matters? Politicians don't think so. They think their own interests are more important. Public opinion suddenly shifted entirely towards handing command to Charles, and the voices grew louder and louder. Even the Anzac forces made some dangerous statements. If it's not Charles in command, we will refuse to fight. We are fighting for the interests of the Allied powers, not for the interests of politicians. We are risking our lives. We hope our sacrifice is worthwhile. Then, shocking news broke. The Germans have confirmed that Charles is fighting in Gallipoli. They intend to eliminate Charles at all costs. They consider Charles more important than Gallipoli or even the Ottoman Empire. Everyone fell silent. They all simultaneously pondered the same question: should Charles be withdrawn now? Chapter 324 Triumphal Parade. Charles held his position at Point A for another 2 days. The damp weather by the sea and the muddy trenches left everyone feeling sticky and uncomfortable. Some tried to take a bath in the sea to feel better, but they soon found it even more uncomfortable after the seawater dried. Unfortunately, the 105th Infantry, positioned behind the defensive line, were assigned to dispose of corpses for the past 2 days. The work seemed simple: dig a large pit and throw in all the bodies they could find. However, the sheer number of highly decomposed corpses and mutilated limbs made the work a dreaded experience for the soldiers. While it was better than fighting the enemy on the front lines, the presence of remaining enemy forces lurking in the jungle made it no better. That day, Charles and Tigeny were discussing the area to be cleared the next day using a map. They needed to first send out snipers to monitor suspicious jungles and caves, and then plan several burial sites to minimize the workload. At that moment, the communications soldier cried out in surprise, rushing over to hand a telegram to Tigeny, excitedly reporting, "General, they're transferring us back. General Winter said they'll issue us rest badges tonight, and we'll board transport ships back to Anchorage first thing tomorrow morning." A rest badge was an iron tag worn around the neck, a measure used by the French army at that time to prevent deserters from escaping with the retreating troops. Tigeny was taken aback, then breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, "We can leave this hellhole." A cheer erupted in the command post, and the soldiers outside also received the news. Immediately, smiles appeared on everyone's faces, some even excitedly danced with their comrades in celebration. Only Billy Shen's eyes flashed with worry. He paced back and forth in the trench a few times, finally mustering the courage to crawl into the commander's room and stand before Charles. "Colonel," Billy Shen said, looking somewhat dejected, "if the 105th Infantry Regiment is to be transferred back to Anchorage, should I return to my original unit?" Charles replied with a half-smile, "If you want to be transferred back, I have no objection." Billy Shen sensed hope in Charles's tone, and his eyes widened with expectation as he looked at Charles. "You mean, I can also choose to stay with the 105th Infantry Regiment?" Charles nodded slightly. "I've already reported your situation to General Winter, and he has no objections. If you're willing, he'll have his staff process your transfer." "I'm willing, Colonel," Billy Shen answered eagerly. "Of course I'm willing." Charles put down his pencil and looked up at Billy Shen. "Have you thought this through? This might not be an ordinary transfer. You might very well serve with the 105th Infantry Regiment on the French front, and you might even become a Frenchman." This meant Billy Shen would have to give up everything in Australia, including his family. Billy Shen hesitated for a moment, then nodded firmly. "Yes, I understand. No regrets?" Charles asked again. "No regrets." Billy Shen didn't hesitate for a moment. A smart choice, Charles thought. His remaining life would no longer be one of poverty and destitution. He would become Charles's personal bodyguard, both on the battlefield and in life. The 105th Infantry Regiment wasn't transferred back to Anchorage, but directly back to France, far from the battlefield. Just as rumored. The Germans might eliminate Charles at all costs, so Charles and the 105th Infantry Regiment's itinerary was kept highly secret. Apart from General Winter, no one in France, including Gallieni, knew about it. This was to avoid the French Minister of the Navy. Charles dared not risk his life. After all, the transport ship he was on was slow and unsinkable, and if it were spotted by German submarines, his chances of survival would be slim. It wasn't until the 105th Infantry Regiment arrived at Toulon that Charles called Gallieni to report. Gallieri's tone was calm. "You're back already, no problem, I'll arrange the train for you. However, they want you to march into Paris in formation." Charles, on the other end of the phone, sounded somewhat surprised. "March into Paris in formation?" "Yes," Gallieri replied. "The Parliament has been discussing this for the past few days. The front lines are at a stalemate, and the soldiers and civilians are growing weary of war. The Parliament believes your victory will boost morale, especially yours." Charles hesitated for a moment, then replied, "No problem, but notify the Parliament 10 minutes before we arrive." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the phone, followed by a knowing hum from Gallieri. After hanging up, Gallieri was stunned for a moment. Damn Parliament, he had almost been fooled by those guys. If the time and place were arranged, even the marching route was predetermined, then the best way for the Germans to eliminate Charles was to have an assassin hide in a house by the street with a rifle, waiting for Charles to appear. Many in Parliament wanted Charles dead. They didn't need to collude with the Germans, they only needed to leak the time and route of the march. Just then, the phone rang again. It was Charles calling once more. "General," Charles said, "you can spread the word that we won't arrive for 3 days." Gallieri inwardly applauded. This would make the Germans think they had time, and then Charles's troops would suddenly appear and swiftly complete this inspiring ceremony. The 105th Infantry Regiment arrived in Paris the next morning. During World War I, trains only traveled about 50 kilometers per hour, and with waiting for military trains carrying supplies to the front lines, the journey from Toulon to Paris, over 800 kilometers, took a full 26 hours. On the train, Charles missed Eric's plane. Although it only traveled a little over 100 kilometers per hour, it went in a straight line and didn't require waiting, perhaps arriving in 6 or 7 hours. The troops disembarked at Lyon train station, disheveled and carrying their rifles, marching into the streets without any cleaning or preparation. The image above shows the Gare de Lyon in Paris, 1896. The French, just waking from their sleep, were initially bewildered by what had happened. They only heard shouts and whistles coming from the street below. Puzzled, they looked out their windows and saw a troop of soldiers passing by. They appeared to have just come from the front lines. Their uniforms were disheveled and filthy, most of them unshaven, looking like a defeated army retreating. But out of politeness, they waved to welcome the troops. Then, suddenly someone exclaimed, "My God, that's the 105th Infantry Regiment, Charles's troops? The ones who won at Gallipoli." "Yes, see him? Charles is there, in the wagon." The crowd erupted in cheers. The initial pity turning into screams of surprise. The news spread by word of mouth, soon reaching every corner of the city, and people flocked to welcome Charles's troops, many even in their pajamas. Chapter 325. It's time to change the military uniform. The 105th Infantry Regiment strolled through the streets like it was a leisurely walk, taking over an hour amidst the cheers and screams of the Parisians before returning to the police training base. Upon arrival, the soldiers ran like madmen, stripping off their clothes as they rushed to the bathhouse, uniforms strewn everywhere. Most were already naked and exposed, yet still clutching their rifles, belts slung over their shoulders, looking somewhat like savages. They wouldn't even consider washing and reusing their uniforms, they were going to get new ones no matter what. Tycoon only relaxed then, removing his cap to tidy his tangled hair, his beard growing like a broom. He turned to Charles beside him and asked, "You're going back to the city garrison headquarters to report, aren't you?" "Yes," Charles replied, then countered, "And you, General, are you going home?" Tycoon's home was in Paris, in the 15th arrondissement. "No," Tycoon shook his head, glancing at the soldiers celebrating after their dismissal. "I'm the commander. I must stay with them at all times, unless I'm given leave." Charles felt a pang of shame. He had just planned to go home after visiting the city garrison headquarters. Tycoon was right. If the commander rushed home as soon as he returned, wouldn't the soldiers follow suit? This made Charles feel somewhat unprofessional. After all, he hadn't attended military academy. In the city garrison headquarters office, Gallery was restless. He would occasionally get up to look at the street outside the window, then sit back down. Gallery himself found it strange. Why was he in such a hurry? He was already back in Paris, knowing he was safe was enough. But even though everyone understood the logic, he couldn't suppress the anxiety in his heart. Only when he saw Laurent's car carrying Charles parked at the headquarters entrance did Gallery breathe a sigh of relief. He straightened his uniform and sat back down in his chair, putting on an indifferent expression. However, when Charles appeared at the entrance of the building to receive the cheers and celebrations of the staff, Gallery unconsciously stood up. After a moment of surprise, Gallery was about to sit down again when Charles stood before him, saluting. "General." Gallery gave a slightly embarrassed hum, glanced at Charles, and suddenly realized he had grown up. It wasn't because Charles's skin was tanned, nor because of the bloodstains on his uniform, nor even because of the stubble on his chin, it was a feeling. Before, he had always seemed like a child, now, he was a soldier. Gallery tried to remain calm, but his voice still trembled slightly. "How is it feeling on the battlefield, Colonel?" "Not bad," Charles said, glancing down at his filthy red trousers. "However, I think our uniforms need changing." Gallery misunderstood Charles's meaning. He nodded. "Of course, have Adrian get 2 new sets of uniforms." "No, General," Charles said, "I mean our uniforms." "What do you mean?" Gallery asked. Charles explained, "Red trousers are very conspicuous on the battlefield, General. They're excellent targets for the enemy. Soldiers do everything they can to get them dirty, some even preferring corduroy trousers from plasterers." Charles had known this before, but because he didn't need to go to the battlefield, he hadn't felt the pain firsthand. Now that his life was threatened, it was urgent. Gallery replied helplessly, "We all know this. But it's not something we can decide." "Then let them change their decision," Charles said, referring to the council. Gallery pondered for a moment, then turned his questioning gaze to Charles. "Perhaps you can persuade them to change their minds, but that might require questioning by Parliament." Charles nodded. "No problem. Compared to his life, what did a parliamentary inquiry matter?" This was actually Charles's own thought. His power in Parliament might still be insufficient to contend with his opponents, but he had the support of the French people, and more importantly, he had personally fought on the battlefield. He had a voice in this matter. What would happen if Parliament disagreed? They might incite public outrage among the French military and civilians, leading to wave after wave of demonstrations, something Parliament certainly didn't want to see. However, Charles still took a shower in the city garrison commander's quarters and changed into a brand new military uniform. He didn't want to go back to see his family looking like this. In the town of Darvaz, the streets and alleys were buzzing with gossip. "Have you heard? Charles is back." "Yes, someone saw him in Paris this morning." "That's amazing. He fought a decisive battle, and he even fought the enemy in the trenches himself." Those who said Charles was afraid to go to the battlefield can shut up now. Camille rushed back with an empty shopping basket and a newspaper in her hand, her face pale. As soon as she got home, she grabbed the phone to call Joka, but Joka was already outside the door. Kamil Djokovic jumped out of the car and practically ran in, his voice preceding his arrival. Good news, Kamil, Charles is back safe. Kamil slammed the microphone down on the receiver, turned around, and asked coldly, what do you mean by safely back, Djokovic? Wasn't Charles always safe? Wasn't he always on the warship, strategizing and not on the battlefield? Djokovic realized he had let something slip and quickly covered it up. I mean, he returned safely from the Dardanelles, but what I heard is different. Kamil interrupted Djokovic. They said Charles landed. He landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, not some strait, and not on a warship. He was in the trenches, face to face with the enemy, and he defeated them with a gun. That's what others say, Djokovic replied with difficulty. But before he could finish, Kamil pulled out a newspaper and waved it in front of him. This is different from the newspaper you showed me, although the date is the same. Can you explain it? Djokovic was stunned, then shrugged in acknowledgement. The important thing is that he's back safe and sound, right? Joka said. Kamil countered, and then? I don't understand why they insisted on sending Charles to the battlefield. Hasn't he done enough for France? Joka was speechless. This was also the question he wanted to ask. Why did Charles have to go to the battlefield, while those members of parliament and their children, and the children of capitalists, who hadn't contributed anything, didn't need to? Just as the atmosphere became awkward, an exclamation came from outside the door. My God, it's Charles. Charles is back, a neighbor shouted into the house. MRS. Bernard, Charles is back. It really is him. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.